At my wedding, I watched my sister slip a crushed pill into my champagne glass. I did not panic. I simply waited for a distraction and switched our drinks. Then she raised her glass for a toast and smirked at me. "Congratulations, little sister. My surprise is coming soon." I smiled back and let her drink. 60 minutes later, my lavish reception descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who constantly underestimated your worth. Growing up in a status-obsessed household in Atlanta, Georgia, I learned early on that love was a transaction. My parents, DeAndre and Valerie, treated affection like a limited resource, and my older sister Serena held a monopoly on it. At 32, Serena was the golden child, the director of a prominent family charity fund, and a woman who lived her entire life for the approval of strangers on social media. I am Maya. I am 29 years old, and my family has always considered me the boring, socially unfit disappointment. My crime was choosing a quiet life. I am a forensic accountant, a job my parents actively mock because it lacks the flashy prestige they crave. When I brought home Julian, a brilliant and grounded cybersecurity consultant, my parents were thoroughly unimpressed. Julian is a good, hard-working black man who treats me like a queen, but in the eyes of DeAndre and Valerie, he was just a computer guy. Their standard for success had already been set by Serena and her husband Trent. Trent is 35, a wealth manager from a wealthy old money family in Boston. He is white arrogant and carries a sense of superiority that fills any room he enters. From the moment Trent married Serena, my parents worshipped the ground he walked on. They viewed his wealth and his whiteness as a badge of honor for our family, a golden ticket into elite circles they desperately wanted to be part of. Trent knew this, and he used it to treat Julian and me with blatant disrespect, constantly making passive-aggressive jokes about our income or our lifestyle. My wedding day was supposed to be a celebration of Julian and me finally starting our lives together. We chose a beautiful historic estate in Buckhead, pouring our own savings into creating an elegant, intimate evening. But my parents hijacked the guest list, filling the ballroom with their country club acquaintances and Trent and his snobby relatives. They turned my wedding into a networking event. Serena even showed up wearing a floor-length silver silk gown that looked suspiciously like a wedding dress designed specifically to pull focus away from me. I let it slide. I had spent 29 years letting things slide, but the universe has a funny way of forcing you to finally draw a line. The reception was in full swing. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the tables, and the jazz band was playing softly in the background. Julian had stepped away to speak with his mother, leaving me alone at the sweetheart table. That was when Serena approached. She glided over with 2 fresh flutes of champagne, a wide, predatory smile on her face. She sat in Julian's empty chair and leaned in close, pretending to fix the floral centerpiece in front of me. I have always had a sharp eye for details. It is literally my job to spot anomalies. As her hand hovered over my glass, I saw her thumb shift. A fine white powder fell from her manicured fingernail straight into my champagne, dissolving instantly into the bubbles. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained a carefully blank mask. Serena leaned back, her smile widening. I knew exactly what she had done. Serena was obsessed with extreme dieting and frequently used heavy prescription laxatives mixed with mild sedatives to maintain her figure. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted the boring, awkward sister to suffer a public, degrading meltdown on the one day I was supposed to be the center of attention. Before she could say a word, a waiter carrying a tray of appetizers accidentally bumped into the back of her chair. Serena spun around, her voice immediately pitching into a shrill reprimand as she berated the poor young man for his clumsiness. It took exactly 3 seconds of her being distracted. I reached over smoothly, swapping my tainted glass with her pristine one. She turned back to me, completely unaware that the board had just been flipped. She picked up the glass that now contained her own toxic cocktail. "Ladies and gentlemen," Serena called out, tapping her fork against the crystal rim. The jazz band faded out. The murmurs of the 300 guests quieted down. Everyone turned their attention to the sweetheart table. Trent stood up from the front row, puffing out his chest with a look of smug anticipation. My parents beamed at their golden child, completely ignoring me. "I want to propose a toast to the bride and groom," Serena announced, her voice projecting through the microphone someone had handed her. "We are all just so surprised and thrilled that you two finally tied the knot. Maya, you have always marched to the beat of your own very quiet, very modest drum." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the audience. I saw my mother cover her mouth, laughing quietly at the jab. "It takes a special kind of man to accept a woman whose idea of ambition is staring at spreadsheets all day." Serena continued, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. "And Julian, you are a brave man. We all know my little sister is not exactly equipped for the high society life. But do not worry. Trent and I will always be here to bail you guys out when things get tough. We know your little computer job and Maya's accounting gig will not pay for a lifestyle like this." Trent laughed out loud, raising his glass. My father nodded in agreement, looking at Trent with pure admiration. Julian, who had just returned to stand behind my chair, placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. I reached up and covered his hand with mine, drawing strength from his presence. "So, here is to Maya and Julian," Serena concluded, turning to look directly at me. The smirk on her face was pure venom. She raised her glass. "Congratulations, little sister. My surprise is coming soon." I picked up my glass, the one she thought was safe. I looked right into her eyes, matching her smirk with a calm, serene smile. "Cheers, Serena," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "I cannot wait for your surprise." She tilted her head back and drank deeply, swallowing every last drop of the champagne. I barely took a sip of mine. As she handed the microphone back to the event coordinator and walked back to Trent's waiting arms, I sat quietly. As a forensic accountant, I deal in cause and effect. I track the numbers until they reveal the undeniable truth. Serena had just made a massive, irreversible deposit into the Bank of Karma. Now all I had to do was sit back and wait for the devastating payout. The first course arrived, and the ballroom buzzed with the sound of clinking silver and polite conversation. Julian squeezed my hand under the table, asking if I was okay. I told him I had never been better. The roasted chicken and asparagus tasted like ash in my mouth, but I chewed methodically, projecting an image of absolute peace. The ballroom was a symphony of wealth and pretense. We ate our meal while I kept a peripheral watch on my sister. Serena was working the room like a politician running for office. She glided from table to table in her silver silk gown, making sure Trent's wealthy Boston relatives saw how perfectly poised she was. She laughed loudly, tossing her head back and holding tightly to Trent's arm as he bragged about his latest portfolio acquisitions to my father's country club friends. 30 minutes passed. I noticed the first signs. Serena touched her stomach while speaking to Trent's mother. She offered a strained smile and shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She took a long sip of ice water, her hand trembling ever so slightly against the crystal glass. A fine sheen of sweat appeared on her forehead. The sedative was beginning to relax her muscles, while the laxative prepared to wage war on her digestive system. I knew she was feeling the first cramps, the dull ache of her own malice turning back on her. 45 minutes passed. The band leader announced it was time for the father-daughter dance. Normally, this would be the bride's moment. But my parents had hijacked the schedule weeks ago. My father, DeAndre, had insisted that since Trent's family flew all the way from Massachusetts, the hosts needed to honor them with a special family dance first. It was a thinly veiled excuse for my father to parade Serena around the dance floor, showing off his golden child to the white elite. I sat at the sweetheart table with Julian and watched them step into the center of the ballroom. The lights dimmed, and a slow jazz melody filled the air. The photographer circled them, flashing bright bursts of light that only seemed to disorient Serena further. My father spun Serena outward. She stumbled slightly, her silver heels catching on the hem of her dress. The sedative was taking hold of her coordination. My mother Valerie clapped from the sidelines, completely oblivious to the gray pallor of her favorite daughter's face. 55 minutes. Serena and my father swayed to the music. Trent stood near the edge of the dance floor, holding a glass of scotch, chatting with his uncle. Serena closed her eyes and leaned heavily against our father. He whispered something to her, probably telling her to stand up straight and smile for the cameras. 60 minutes exactly. The music swelled to a crescendo. My father twirled Serena one more time. When she came out of the spin, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes flew open wide with a terror I had never seen before. She dropped her arms and grabbed her stomach, bending forward with a sudden violent gasp. The ballroom fell completely silent, except for the band, who stumbled to an awkward halt. My father reached out to steady her, asking loudly if she was feeling faint. Serena shook her head frantically. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead a loud guttural gurgle echoed through the silent room. It was loud enough to be picked up by the nearby microphone. Serena turned to run toward the hallway leading to the restrooms, but the sedative had turned her legs to lead. Her high heels tangled in the heavy silk of her inappropriate gown. She took 2 steps and collapsed onto the pristine white marble dance floor. It happened in an instant. Her body entirely relaxed by the medication surrendered to the extreme force of the laxatives she had brought to ruin my day. A dark, foul-smelling stain rapidly bloomed down the back of her expensive silver silk dress, pooling directly onto the polished marble. The stench hit the front row of tables immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the 300 elite guests. Someone screamed. Trent's mother covered her mouth in absolute horror, stepping backward so quickly she nearly knocked over a waiter, his face twisted into a mask of pure repulsion. Trent stared at his wife lying in a soiled heap on the floor. Instead of rushing to help her, he backed away in sheer disgust, covering his nose with his expensive suit jacket. He looked humiliated by her mere presence, muttering under his breath about how this would look to his colleagues. My mother shrieked, pushing her way through the crowd. She rushed onto the dance floor to drape her shawl over Serena, but slipped on the mess and fell hard onto her knees, ruining her own designer outfit. The scene was a disaster of epic proportions. Paramedics were called because Serena, heavily sedated and utterly broken by the humiliation, could only lie there sobbing incoherently. The hotel staff quickly moved in with biohazard protocols, cordoning off the dance floor and ushering the disgusted guests toward the lobby. Julian and I watched the entire spectacle from our table. He looked at me with raised eyebrows, and I simply took a sip of my water. My father and Trent dragged a hysterical, reeking Serena into the VIP bridal suite down the hall. My mother followed them, weeping loudly about the ruined evening and the embarrassment in front of Trent's family. Julian and I walked in quietly a few minutes later, shutting the heavy oak door behind us. The sound of the lock clicking into place felt like a starting gun. The moment the door clicked shut, the grief and embarrassment in the room instantly weaponized into rage. The target, as always, was me. My mother marched across the room, her dress stained and her face twisted in fury. Before I could say a word, she raised her hand and slapped me hard across the cheek. The sharp sting radiated through my jaw. I did not flinch. Julian instantly stepped between us, his broad shoulders shielding me from another strike. He warned her in a low, dangerous rumble never to touch his wife again. My mother ignored him, pointing a trembling finger at me. Her eyes were wild, darting around the room as if searching for a weapon. "What did you do to her?" she screamed, her voice cracking. "You put something in her food, did not you?" My father stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "She poisoned her sister," he yelled, pacing the floor. "Serena is perfectly healthy. She does not just collapse and soil herself in public. You have always been jealous of her, Maya, ever since she married Trent and became director of the charity fund. You could not handle that she looked better than you at your own wedding, so you drugged her." Trent, who had been standing near the window furiously texting on his phone, turned around with a look of pure, venomous entitlement. His Boston accent cut through the shouting. "You people are unbelievable," he spat, looking at me with utter disgust. "I paid for the floral arrangements. I paid for the open bar to elevate this pathetic budget wedding of yours, and you drug my wife out of spite." I calmly reached up and touched my stinging cheek. I looked at the 4 of them. Serena was in the attached bathroom, still loudly getting sick and crying. Trent pulled his suit jacket straight, glaring at Julian and me. I am calling the police, Maya. He threatened, his voice deadly quiet. You are a sociopath, and you are going to jail. But I am not stopping there. I know the managing director at Julian's cybersecurity firm. One phone call from me tomorrow morning, and his career is over. You will both be unemployable and bankrupt by the end of the week. My mother nodded vigorously, wiping her eyes. You deserve to be in jail for ruining this family, she spat. We are done with you, Maya. Do not expect another dime or a single favor from us ever again. Trent pulled out his phone, holding it up like a weapon. I am dialing 911 right now, he said, unless you agree to sign over your 15% share of the family trust to compensate for the extreme emotional distress you just caused my wife. They all stared at me, expecting me to crumble. They expected me to beg for forgiveness, to plead for my husband's job, to surrender my assets, just to keep the peace. That is what the old Maya would have done. I looked at Julian and he gave me a subtle nod. I turned my attention back to Trent and my parents. The stinging in my cheek faded, replaced by a profound, icy calm. I took a step forward, closing the distance between me and the man who thought he could destroy my life with a single phone call. I looked Trent right in his angry eyes. Call them, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly through the silent room. Call the police right now, Trent. He blinked clearly, taken aback that I was not crying or begging for forgiveness. What did you say? He asked, stepping back slightly. I told you to call the police, I repeated, taking another steady step forward. Because the security cameras in the main ballroom are upgraded to 4K high definition. They have a perfect unobstructed view of the sweetheart table. They captured your lovely wife slipping a crushed pill into my champagne glass while I was away. I simply switched our drinks when she turned around to yell at a waiter. My mother gasped and stumbled backward, clutching her ruined dress. You are lying, she cried out, her voice shrill and desperate. Serena would never do something so wicked to her own sister. You made this up to cover your tracks because you are sick with jealousy. My father shook his head, looking at me with pure disgust. You have lost your mind, Maya. You have always tried to tear her down because she is everything you are not. Trent held his phone tightly, but his thumb hovered over the screen. He did not dial the number. His corporate survival instincts were kicking in fast. He knew I would not bluff about something so easily verifiable. A police investigation meant viewing the security tapes, and those tapes would end with his wife being escorted out in handcuffs for attempting to poison a bride at a high-profile wedding reception. The scandal would ruin his precious reputation permanently. Trent slowly lowered his phone. You are a complete sociopath, he muttered, trying to save face while his panic grew. Fine, we will not involve the authorities and drag our family name through the mud because of your psychotic behavior. But you just dug your own grave, Maya. He pointed a trembling finger at Julian, who was standing right beside me, like a solid wall of support. You and this nobody husband of yours are finished. I happen to know the managing director at Julian's cybersecurity firm personally. We play golf every other weekend at the club. One phone call from me tomorrow morning and his career is over. He will be blacklisted from every major tech firm on the East Coast before noon. Julian tensed beside me, his jaw clenching, but I squeezed his hand to keep him calm. Trent was not done asserting his imaginary dominance. And as for you, Maya, he continued, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. You are going to pay for the extreme humiliation my wife suffered tonight. I am giving you exactly 24 hours to sign over your 15% share of the family trust. Consider it compensation for the emotional and physical distress you caused Serena. If you refuse to sign the transfer papers, I will personally make sure Julian is fired, and I will sue you in civil court until you are drowning in legal fees. You will be penniless and unemployable by the end of the month. You will have to sell your house and beg on the street because no one in this city will touch you once I am done spreading the word about what you did here tonight. My father nodded vigorously, crossing his arms over his chest. You should listen to him, Maya. You owe your sister for ruining her reputation tonight in front of all those important people. Hand over your share of the trust and maybe Trent will show you some mercy. My mother chimed in, agreeing completely with this extortion. "It is the least you can do after bringing such shame to this family," she said, her face twisted in a bitter scowl. "You never deserved that trust money anyway. You only care about your boring little accounting job. Give the money to Serena. She needs it to manage her charity properly and maintain her lifestyle." I looked at the people who were supposed to be my flesh and blood. They were entirely willing to steal my inheritance and destroy my husband's livelihood to protect a woman who had just tried to drug me on my wedding day. They truly believed that because they had money and social status, they held all the power in the room. They thought I was just the quiet middle child who would fold under pressure and hand over everything I owned just to keep the peace. The sounds of Serena sobbing and retching in the attached bathroom echoed through the suite, serving as a pathetic soundtrack to their demands. A laugh escaped my lips. It started small and grew into a genuine, hearty sound that echoed off the suite walls. My father took a step back, his face contorting in confusion. Trent narrowed his eyes, his face turning bright red. "You think this is funny?" he demanded, stepping toward me again. "You think losing your livelihood and your money is a joke?" I stopped laughing and looked at him with absolute pity. "I think your arrogance is funny, Trent," I replied calmly. "You talk about power and money as if you are the only one who understands how they work. You think because I do not flash designer brands or brag on social media that I am helpless against you." I reached into my small white bridal clutch. My mother watched me warily, as if I might pull out a weapon. Instead, I pulled out a heavy, solid gold embossed keycard. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table between us. It landed with a sharp, heavy clatter that made everyone jump. "What is this?" my father asked, frowning at the shiny object. "That is the master keycard to this entire estate," I said smoothly. "You see, Trent, while Serena was busy playing director at a charity she treats like a personal piggy bank, and you were busy throwing your clients' money around to feel important, I was actually working." I walked over to the heavy oak door and pulled it wide open, revealing the empty hallway outside. "My forensic accounting firm does not just look at spreadsheets," I explained, watching the confusion slowly morph into pure dread on Trent's pale face. "We specialize in corporate liquidations and hostile acquisitions. 6 months ago, the hospitality group that owns this historic venue went completely bankrupt. They were drowning in debt and desperate for a bailout. My private equity group bought that debt for pennies on the dollar. I do not just have an accounting gig, Trent. I own this entire property and everything on it." My mother gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest. "That is impossible," she stammered, her eyes darting from the keycard to my face. "You drive a 5-year-old car. You live in a normal house. You do not have that kind of money. I live a quiet life because I do not need to show off to feel valuable," I told her coldly. "So no, Trent, you will not be calling security on me tonight, because as the sole owner of this estate, I am officially evicting you, Serena, and my parents from the premises." Trent's mouth opened, but no sound came out. My father looked completely paralyzed, staring at the gold keycard on the table as if it were highly radioactive. "You have exactly 10 minutes to pack up your crying wife and leave my property," I announced, keeping my voice dangerously calm and authoritative. "If you are still in this suite when the clock runs out, my personal security team will physically drag all of you out by your hair and dump you on the sidewalk in front of the local news crews who are already circling outside the gates." I linked my arm through Julian's, feeling his suppressed laughter vibrating in his chest. "Oh, and Trent." I paused at the threshold, throwing a chilling glance over my shoulder at the man who had just threatened my family. "Before you try to get my husband fired tomorrow morning, you might want to check who holds the primary debt on that massive commercial real estate project your firm just broke ground on in Midtown. Have a safe drive home. You are going to need all the rest you can get for the war you just started." The silence in the days following the wedding eviction was deafening, but I knew it was only the calm before the storm. Serena was never one to suffer in silence, especially when she could weaponize an audience. 3 days after I kicked them out of my venue, my phone started vibrating relentlessly. Notifications flooded my screen. Serena had gone live on social media. I sat at my kitchen island and watched the broadcast. She was makeup-free, wearing an oversized cashmere sweater to look fragile, sitting in the pristine living room of her mansion. She was weeping. Not the messy, real tears she shed in the hotel bathroom, but perfect, calculated, glistening tears, designed for maximum sympathy. I never thought my own flesh and blood could be so cruel, she choked out to her 50,000 followers. She painted a horrifying picture of a mentally unstable younger sister consumed by bitter jealousy. She told them I had harbored a lifelong obsession with destroying her happiness, and that I had finally snapped, spiking her drink with dangerous chemicals to humiliate her on what was supposed to be a beautiful family evening. The comments poured in a tidal wave of strangers calling me a monster, a psychopath, a criminal. My parents wasted no time capitalizing on the victim narrative. I had expected them to be furious about being kicked out of the venue, but their reaction was a masterclass in manipulation. Less than an hour after the live stream ended, I received a long text message from my father. It was formal, cold, and legally binding in its tone. Maya, your mother and I are horrified by your actions. You have disgraced this family and endangered your sister's life out of sheer spite. Until you publicly confess and make financial restitution to Serena and Trent, as requested, do not contact us. You are no longer our daughter. I stared at the screen, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. 29 years of trying to be the good daughter, getting the right degrees, paying my own way, staying out of trouble. All of it meant nothing. It was all erased because I refused to be their scapegoat anymore. They did not want a daughter. They wanted an audience for Serena. I did not reply to his message. I just deleted the entire thread and blocked their numbers. But Trent was not satisfied with just taking my family. He wanted blood. He wanted to make good on his threat in the VIP suite. The next morning, Julian came home early from his cybersecurity firm. His face was drawn, his shoulders tense. Trent had made the call. Julian sat across from me at the kitchen island, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. My managing director pulled me into a closed-door meeting, he said quietly. Trent spun a story about us being involved in corporate espionage and unstable behavior. Because Trent's wealth management firm controls the retirement portfolios of half our executive board. They panicked. They did not fire me outright, but they suspended my access to all secure networks pending an internal investigation. I am on indefinite administrative leave. Julian looked at me not with anger, but with a weary resolve. He had worked for years to build his reputation in the cybersecurity sector, and Trent was trying to dismantle it over a bruised ego. He is trying to starve us out, Maya, Julian said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. He wants us panicking about our mortgage and our bills, so we come crawling back to beg for mercy. I reached across the counter and took his hands, feeling the familiar warmth and strength in his grip. He is trying to make us panic. I told him, my voice dropping to a calm, steady register. But he forgot one crucial detail. You do not corner a forensic accountant and a cybersecurity expert and expect them to just roll over and die. I did not take to the internet to defend myself. I did not post a tearful rebuttal video or release a statement. Silence is a predator's worst enemy because they cannot anticipate your next move. Instead, I retreated to my home office. Julian and I set up a secure, encrypted network. Trent had opened the door to a war, and he had stupidly handed me the exact thread I needed to pull. Back in the bridal suite, I had warned him to check who held the primary debt on his massive midtown real estate project. What Trent did not know was that during the acquisition of that debt, my private equity group had gained legal access to perform preliminary audits on the parent company's financial health. I had a backdoor into Trent's entire wealth management firm. For 48 hours, I barely slept. I lived on black coffee and sheer adrenaline. The numbers danced across my multiple monitors, forming a complex web of shell companies, dummy corporations, and phantom accounts. Trent was good at hiding his tracks. He used layers of misdirection that would have fooled government regulators for years. But he was not dealing with a government agency. He was dealing with a woman who had spent her entire life observing the details everyone else ignored. Julian ran a decryption protocol to bypass the secondary firewalls Trent had hastily erected after the wedding. I watched the progress bar inch toward 100%. The silence in the office was absolute, broken only by the steady hum of the computer processors. Finally, the screen flashed green. Access granted. I pulled up the core transaction logs for Trent's primary offshore holding accounts. I started running matching algorithms looking for the specific financial anomalies that signal embezzlement. The results populated on my screen row after row of wire transfers routing through the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. I leaned in closer, my eyes scanning the recipient accounts. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned away from his clients' portfolios to cover massive, catastrophic trading losses he had incurred earlier in the year. He was running a sophisticated shell game, robbing his investors to keep his business afloat. But that was not the discovery that made the breath catch in my throat. I cross-referenced the origin of the latest incoming wire transfers, the ones keeping his sinking firm from total collapse. The screen illuminated the source. The money was not coming from a corporate investor. It was coming directly from the accounts of the Atlanta Community Uplift Foundation. It was the philanthropic family charity that Serena directed. My sister was not just a spoiled socialite living off her husband's wealth. She was actively bleeding her own charity dry, funneling millions in tax-exempt donation funds directly into Trent's failing business to keep up the facade of their elite lifestyle. They were both federal criminals. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. They wanted to destroy my reputation and take my assets. But I had just found the key to locking them both in a federal penitentiary. The morning after my discovery, I arrived at my office building in the financial district. The glass and steel tower housed some of the most powerful firms in Atlanta. My firm occupied the entire top floor. We were not just accountants. We were the people corporate boards called when millions of dollars vanished without a trace. My corner office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. A heavy mahogany desk sat in the center of the room. It was a space designed to project authority and discretion. I sat down and placed a single manila folder perfectly in the center of my desk. Inside were the printed Cayman Islands bank statements I had decrypted the night before. I knew Trent would come. Arrogant men always need the last word. They cannot stand the thought of a woman they deem inferior holding her ground. It happened exactly at 9 o'clock. I heard the muffled sounds of a commotion in the reception area outside my door. My assistant tried to stop him, but Trent simply pushed past her. The heavy glass door to my office swung open and slammed against the wall. Trent stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. He wore a bespoke navy suit and a furious expression. He looked around my office with a sneer. In his mind, I was just a lowly clerk pushing papers in a cubicle. The fact that I had a corner office with a panoramic view did not even register in his rage-blinded brain. He stormed across the expensive carpet and stopped right in front of my desk. He did not ask to sit down. He wanted to tower over me. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He threw them onto my desk with a loud slap. The pages slid across the mahogany, stopping just short of my manila folder. "That is a non-disclosure agreement and a drafted public apology," he announced, his voice sharp and demanding. "You are going to sign every single page right now. Then you are going to go on Instagram Live and read that apology to Serena's followers. You will tell them that your mind has been fragile and that you hallucinated the entire poisoning incident. You will take full responsibility for ruining the wedding." I looked at the documents and then up at his flushed, angry face. I said nothing. My silence only infuriated him more. He leaned over my desk, planting his palms on the wood. "If you do not sign those papers right now, Julian is completely finished," he threatened, his voice dropping to a vicious sneer. "I have a lunch meeting scheduled with his managing director at noon. I have already drafted the email outlining a pattern of erratic behavior and corporate espionage risks regarding your husband. The moment I hit send, his security clearance is revoked permanently. He will never work in cybersecurity again. And when he is unemployed and resents you for destroying his life, I will bury you in civil lawsuits until you are living out of your car. Trent stood up straight, crossing his arms over his chest. He puffed out his chest, expecting me to burst into tears. He expected me to reach for a pen and sign my own humiliation into permanent legal record. He thought he had backed me into a corner where my only option was absolute surrender. I looked at the non-disclosure agreement. I calmly picked up the thick stack of papers and dropped them straight into the shredder sitting next to my desk. The machine whirred loudly as it chewed his expensive legal threats into tiny, worthless ribbons of paper. Trent's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. He took a breath to yell, but I held up one finger. I stood up from my chair. I walked slowly around my desk and moved toward the heavy glass door. Trent watched me with confused anger as I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. The loud click of the lock echoed in the quiet office. I reached over and closed the vertical blinds, shutting out the view of the reception area. The room was suddenly very private and very quiet. I walked back to my desk and sat down. Trent was staring at me, his false bravado faltering for a fraction of a second. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" he demanded. I placed my hands flat on the desk and looked right through him. "I am giving you a lesson in cause and effect." "Trent," I said, my voice low and steady. "You see, you made a very critical error when you decided to declare war on me. You assumed that because I do not post pictures of luxury vacations or wear designer labels that I am powerless. You assumed my job was just balancing checkbooks for small businesses." I slid the manila folder across the desk until it rested exactly where his destroyed documents had been. I opened it. I spread the printed bank statements out so they faced him. "Take a look, Trent," I instructed. He glanced down at the papers. For a moment he looked annoyed. Then his eyes caught the logo of the offshore bank in the Cayman Islands. He saw the routing numbers. He saw the encrypted account names. The color drained out of his face so fast he looked physically ill. His mouth fell open slightly, but no words came out. He stared at the high-definition printouts of his own secret financial ruin. "You have been stealing from your clients for over a year," I explained, my tone completely conversational, as if discussing the weather. "You took massive risks on aggressive trades, and you lost millions. Instead of reporting the losses and facing the music, you started moving client funds through dummy corporations in the Bahamas. You siphoned their money into offshore accounts to cover your margins and keep your wealth management firm looking solvent. You are running a multi-million-dollar shell game, and the entire foundation is rotting." Trent's hands began to shake. He reached out and touched the paper as if hoping it was an illusion. "How did you get these?" he whispered, his voice entirely stripped of its Boston arrogance. He sounded like a terrified little boy. "I bypassed your secondary firewalls last night," I told him. "You used terrible encryption protocols for someone trying to hide federal crimes. But that is not even the best part, Trent." I pulled out the final piece of paper and laid it gently on top of the pile. This paper showed the routing history of the most recent deposits keeping his firm afloat. I tapped my finger on the highlighted numbers. "I tracked the incoming funds holding your firm together," I continued. "They did not come from an anonymous corporate investor. They came directly from the Atlanta Community Uplift Foundation, Serena's family charity. You and my sister have been bleeding a tax-exempt philanthropic organization dry to fund your fraudulent business and maintain your elite status. That is wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering." Trent stumbled backward. His knees hit the edge of the leather guest chair and he collapsed into it. He looked like all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. His chest heaved as panic finally set in. He realized that the boring sister, the one his family mocked at every holiday gathering, possessed the exact skills required to dismantle his entire fake empire. "You thought you could destroy my husband over a bruised ego," I said, leaning forward slightly. "But you walked into the office of a senior partner at a forensic accounting firm that specializes in corporate liquidation. You handed me the weapon I needed to destroy you. You are not going to call Julian's boss at noon, Trent. You are not going to file any civil suits against me. In fact, you are going to sit in that chair and listen very carefully to what happens next." The silence in the room was absolute. Trent was paralyzed by the undeniable truth staring up at him from my desk. The arrogant, wealthy bully who had threatened to ruin my life was gone. In his place was a broken criminal who suddenly realized his entire existence was entirely in my hands. I sat perfectly still at the sweetheart table, watching Serena glide back to her seat beside Trent. The jazz band resumed playing a soft, sultry melody that floated through the ballroom. My husband Julian squeezed my hand under the table, his thumb drawing soothing circles against my skin. He leaned in and whispered that I looked incredibly calm for a bride dealing with such a chaotic family. I simply smiled and took a tiny sip of my safe champagne. I was calm because I knew mathematics and chemistry were on my side. The heavy prescription laxative Serena used for her extreme dieting was designed to act fast. Combined with the mild sedative she had added to ensure my complete public breakdown, the clock was ticking down to 0. I did not have to lift a finger. I just had to wait for gravity and biology to take over. 20 minutes passed. The catering staff moved silently through the room serving a lavish multi-course dinner. I watched Serena from the corner of my eye. She was picking at her roasted asparagus when the first sign hit her. She touched her stomach, her manicured fingers pressing tightly against the silver silk of her inappropriate gown. She offered a strained smile to Trent's mother, who was sitting across from her. Serena shifted her weight in her chair, crossing and uncrossing her legs. A fine sheen of sweat appeared on her forehead, catching the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. She reached for her ice water and drank deeply, her hand trembling just enough to make the ice cubes clink against the glass. The sedative was beginning to relax her central nervous system, while the laxative prepared to wage absolute war on her digestive tract. 40 minutes into the dinner, the band leader stepped up to the microphone. Normally, this would be the moment for the bride and groom to take the floor for their first dance. But my parents had hijacked the entire wedding schedule weeks ago. My father DeAndre had insisted that since Trent's wealthy old money family flew all the way down from Boston, we needed to honor them with a special tribute first. It was a thinly veiled excuse for my father to parade Serena around the dance floor, showing off his golden child to the white elite. He stood up and offered his hand to Serena. She hesitated, looking pale and unwell, but her obsession with maintaining her perfect image won out. She took my father's hand and let him lead her to the center of the polished marble dance floor. The lights dimmed, casting a soft, romantic spotlight directly on them. The photographer circled them like a shark, flashing bright bursts of light that made Serena blink heavily. The sedative was clearly taking a toll on her coordination. As the band launched into a slow traditional jazz ballad, my father spun Serena outward. She stumbled, her silver stiletto catching on the heavy hem of her gown. My mother Valerie sat at the edge of the dance floor, clapping her hands together, completely oblivious to the gray, sickly pallor of her favorite daughter's face. Trent stood near the bar, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, chatting loudly with his uncle about his portfolio acquisitions. No one noticed that Serena was fighting a losing battle against her own body. 50 minutes had passed since the toast. Serena and my father swayed to the music, but she was leaning heavily against his shoulder. She closed her eyes tight, breathing in shallow, erratic gasps. I saw my father whisper something to her, probably reprimanding her to stand up straight and smile for the cameras. He tried to twirl her one more time, pushing her away from his body. When she came out of the spin, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes flew open wide with a terror I had never seen before. The sedative had completely relaxed her muscles, destroying any physical control she had left. She dropped her arms and grabbed her stomach, bending forward with a sudden violent shudder. My father reached out to steady her, asking loudly if she was feeling faint. Serena shook her head frantically, turning toward the hallway that led to the restrooms. But her legs simply refused to work. She took 2 shaky steps and collapsed onto the pristine white marble. The music stumbled to a halt. The ballroom fell completely silent. And then a loud guttural gurgle echoed through the room, amplified by the perfect acoustics of the historic estate. It happened in an instant. Her body entirely relaxed by the medication surrendered to the extreme force of the laxatives she had meant for me. A dark, foul-smelling stain rapidly bloomed down the back of her expensive silver silk dress, pooling directly onto the polished white marble. The horrible stench hit the front row of tables immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the 300 elite guests. Someone screamed. Trent's mother covered her mouth in absolute horror, stepping backward so quickly she nearly knocked over a waiter holding a tray of champagne. The waiter recoiled, his face twisting into a mask of pure repulsion. Trent stared at his wife lying in a soiled heap on the floor. Instead of rushing to help her, he backed away in sheer disgust, covering his nose with his expensive suit jacket. He looked humiliated by her mere presence, muttering under his breath about how this would look to his corporate colleagues. My mother shrieked, pushing her way through the horrified crowd. She rushed onto the dance floor, attempting to drape her shawl over Serena, but she slipped on the mess and fell hard onto her knees, ruining her own designer outfit. The scene was a disaster of epic proportions. Paramedics were called because Serena, heavily sedated and utterly broken by the humiliation, could only lie there sobbing incoherently in her own filth. The hotel staff quickly moved in with biohazard protocols, cordoning off the dance floor and ushering the disgusted guests toward the lobby. Julian and I watched the entire spectacle from our table. He looked at me with raised eyebrows, and I simply took a sip of my water, maintaining a serene expression. My father and Trent eventually dragged a hysterical, reeking Serena down the hall and into the VIP bridal suite. My mother followed them, weeping loudly about the ruined evening and the embarrassment in front of Trent's family. Julian and I walked in quietly a few minutes later, shutting the heavy oak door behind us. The moment the door clicked shut, the grief and embarrassment in the room instantly weaponized into rage. The target, as always, was me. My mother marched across the room, her dress stained and her face twisted in fury. Before I could say a word, she raised her hand and slapped me hard across the cheek. The sharp sting radiated through my jaw. I did not flinch. Julian instantly stepped between us, his broad shoulders shielding me from another strike. He warned her in a low, dangerous rumble never to touch his wife again. My mother ignored him, pointing a trembling finger at me. "What did you do to her?" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You put something in her food, did not you?" My father stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "She poisoned her sister," he yelled, pacing the floor. "Serena is perfectly healthy. She does not just collapse and soil herself in public. You have always been jealous of her, Maya, ever since she married Trent and became director of the charity fund. You could not handle that she looked better than you at your own wedding, so you drugged her." Trent, who had been standing near the window furiously typing on his phone, turned around with a look of pure venomous entitlement. His arrogant Boston accent cut through the shouting. "You people are unbelievable," he spat, looking at me with utter disgust. "I paid for the floral arrangements. I paid for the open bar to elevate this pathetic budget wedding of yours. And you drug my wife out of spite. I am calling the police, Maya." He threatened, his voice deadly quiet. "You are a sociopath, and you are going to jail. But I am not stopping there. I am going to destroy everything you have." They all stared at me, expecting me to crumble. They expected me to beg for forgiveness, to plead for mercy, just to keep the peace. That is what the old Maya would have done. But the old Maya died the moment Serena dropped that powder into my glass. I looked at Julian and he gave me a subtle, affirming nod. I turned my attention back to Trent and my parents. The stinging in my cheek faded, replaced by a profound, icy calm. I took a step forward, closing the distance between me and the man who thought he could end my life with a single phone call. Trent stumbled out of my office looking like a ghost. I watched the heavy glass door click shut behind him. The threat against Julian was neutralized. I sat at my desk, feeling the adrenaline slowly recede, leaving behind a cold, calculating clarity. I had the evidence I needed to send Trent and Serena to federal prison, but the destruction was not yet complete. I packed the printed bank statements into my briefcase and headed home. Julian was waiting for me. I told him what happened. He hugged me. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother, Valerie. The first communication since my father declared I was no longer their daughter. The message was unusually polite, asking me to come to the historic family home in Buckhead that evening. She claimed she and my father wanted to talk things out and find a peaceful resolution to this terrible family rift. Julian warned me not to go. He said it was an obvious trap. I knew he was right, but I had to go. I needed to see exactly what Trent had told them. I drove through the winding tree-lined streets of Buckhead until I reached Big Mama's house. It was a sprawling historic estate that had been in our family for 3 generations. It was my grandmother's pride and joy, and it represented everything my parents valued most: legacy, wealth, and status. I parked in the circular driveway and walked up to the heavy oak front door. I did not bother knocking. I just turned the handle and walked inside. The atmosphere in the house was heavy and unnaturally quiet. I walked into the formal living room. My parents were not setting out a peace offering. They were sitting stiffly on the velvet sofa. Across from them sat a man in a cheap gray suit, holding a thick leather portfolio. It was Marcus Vance, a sleazy local attorney my father sometimes used for property disputes. The moment I walked in, my father's face hardened into a mask of pure contempt. "Sit down, Maya," my father DeAndre ordered, his voice lacking any warmth. "We are putting an end to your destructive behavior tonight." I did not sit. I remained standing near the arched doorway, observing the room. There was no sign of Trent or Serena. They had sent my parents to do their dirty work. I asked what Marcus Vance was doing here. My mother Valerie stood up, smoothing her designer skirt. Her eyes were cold and furious. She pointed a manicured finger at me. "We know what you did," she yelled. "Trent came to us in tears this afternoon. He told us how you threatened him in your office with fabricated financial documents. He told us you are trying to frame him for federal crimes just because you are a bitter, jealous woman who cannot stand to see your sister happy." I stared at her, feeling a profound sense of pity mixed with disgust. Trent was a cornered rat. He had run straight to his most gullible victims and spun a story of persecution. I told my mother she was blindly trusting a criminal. I told them Trent was embezzling millions from his clients and using Serena's charity as a money laundering front. I said I had the offshore bank statements to prove it. My father slammed his hand down on the glass coffee table, making the expensive crystal decor rattle. "Stop lying," he roared. "You have harbored this sick obsession with ruining Serena since you were children. You could not handle being the ugly duckling. You could not handle that Trent chose a beautiful, vibrant woman instead of a miserable accountant. So you concocted this insane story about embezzlement and money laundering. You are trying to destroy the family name out of pure spite." Marcus Vance cleared his throat and opened his leather portfolio. He pulled out a stack of legal documents and laid them on the table. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell have asked me to draft these papers," he said in a nasal voice. "Given your erratic behavior and your threats against their son-in-law, they are taking protective measures. These documents constitute a formal renunciation of your rights to the family estate. You will sign away any future claim to this house and any inheritance. If you do not sign them voluntarily, they will pursue a restraining order and file a defamation suit against you on Trent's behalf." I looked at the documents on the table. They wanted to disinherit me completely to protect a man who was actively robbing them blind. They were willing to discard their own daughter to preserve the illusion of Serena's perfect marriage. It was the ultimate betrayal. 29 years of obedience and loyalty erased because I refused to play the role of the quiet, supportive failure. I looked at my mother. I asked her if she really believed Trent over her own flesh and blood. She did not even hesitate. "Trent is a successful wealth manager," she spat. "He comes from a good family. He provides for Serena beautifully. You are just trying to tear them down because your own husband is facing suspension at work. Trent told us all about Julian's unstable behavior and corporate espionage risks. You two are toxic, and we will not let you drag Serena down with you." The depth of Trent's manipulation was staggering. He had not just lied about his own crimes. He had weaponized Julian's forced administrative leave, flipping the narrative to make us look like the criminals. I felt a cold laugh bubbling up in my chest. I asked my father if he was really going to let Marcus Vance steal my birthright, based on the word of a man he had known for less than 2 years. My father stood up, puffing out his chest. He looked at me with an expression of supreme arrogance. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he was the powerful patriarch protecting his legacy. "You do not know anything about Trent," my father said proudly. You think he is struggling financially just because you printed out some fake spreadsheets. You are so desperate to see him fail, but you are completely clueless. Trent is on the verge of closing the biggest real estate development deal in Midtown. He is expanding his entire firm. My father took a step closer to me, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across his face. And I know for a fact that his business is solid because I personally backed him. The room seemed to freeze. The air went completely still. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I looked at my father and asked him exactly what he meant. My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction. Your father is a smart investor, Maya. He recognizes a brilliant opportunity when he sees one. Unlike you, we actually support family. Trent needed temporary liquid capital to secure the commercial zoning permits for his new development. He came to us because he wanted to keep the profits within the family. My father crossed his arms, looking like a king who had just secured his empire. I took out a second mortgage on this house last week, he announced proudly. I gave Trent $2 million in cash to finalize his expansion. In 6 months, he is going to return the principal with a 20% interest yield. We are going to be silent partners in the most lucrative commercial space in Atlanta. You thought you could scare us with your little accounting tricks, but we are actively building wealth with him. So go ahead and sign those papers, Maya. You are not getting a dime of this investment. I stared at the man who had raised me. I looked around the beautiful historic living room at the antique furniture and the hand-carved crown molding. Big Mama's house. It was the only tangible legacy our family had. It was fully paid off decades ago, representing the blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors. And my father, in his desperate, greedy quest to be associated with elite wealth, had handed the deed over to a federal criminal. Trent did not need $2 million for a commercial real estate expansion. He needed $2 million to plug the gaping hole in his offshore accounts before the SEC auditors noticed the missing client funds. Trent had not just stolen from strangers and charities. He had looked my arrogant father in the eye and convinced him to sign away the family home to cover his catastrophic trading losses. The true scale of the fraud hit me with the force of a freight train. My parents had called me here to stab me in the back, to strip me of my inheritance, and cast me out of the family forever. But they did not realize they were already standing in a burning building. Trent had taken everything from them, and they were too blinded by their own prejudice and greed to see the smoke. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not try to convince them anymore. The time for warnings had passed. I looked at the legal documents on the glass table. I walked over and picked up the pen. My parents watched me with smug satisfaction, thinking they had finally broken my spirit. I signed my name on the dotted line, renouncing my claim to the estate. I did not care about the house anymore because in a few days it would belong to the bank. I dropped the pen on the table. I looked at my father and smiled. It was a cold, empty smile that made him shift uncomfortably. You are absolutely right, Dad, I said, my voice soft and echoing in the quiet room. Trent is going to get exactly what he deserves. And so are you. I turned around and walked out the front door, leaving them to celebrate their magnificent investment. The trap had indeed snapped shut, but I was not the one caught inside. I drove away from my parents' house feeling a strange sense of liberation. The heavy burden of trying to earn their love had finally been lifted from my shoulders entirely. They had willingly handed over $2 million and the deed to our family legacy to a man who was running a massive financial scam. They had chosen their golden child and their fake prestige over my warnings and my loyalty. When I returned home, I found Julian working in his office surrounded by glowing monitors. I told him what happened, and he just shook his head in disbelief. We spent the next 3 weeks operating in complete silence. Predators do not announce their presence before they strike. My private equity group had officially finalized the acquisition of the primary debt on Trent's Midtown real estate project. Because Trent had recklessly intertwined his business accounts with the Atlanta Community Uplift Foundation, the charity was now legally subject to a comprehensive forensic audit. It was my job to review the books, and I volunteered to deliver the financial transparency report at their upcoming annual fundraising gala. I spent days tracing every stolen dollar through a complex maze of shell companies, fake vendor invoices, and offshore accounts. The trail of financial breadcrumbs always led straight back to Serena and Trent. The evidence I gathered was absolute, irrefutable, and devastating. I organized every single fraudulent transaction into a crystal clear presentation that even a child could understand. I was not just going to report them to the authorities. I was going to strip away their social armor and expose them to the very people they desperately wanted to impress. The gala took place on a humid Friday night in the grand ballroom of the most expensive hotel in downtown Atlanta. It was the crowning social event of the season, designed to showcase the generosity of the city's elite. The room was dripping in crystal chandeliers and towering arrangements of white orchids that cost more than most people's annual salaries. I walked into the venue wearing a sharply tailored black suit that made me look like a grim reaper amidst a sea of pastel silk gowns and velvet tuxedos. I stood near the back of the room observing the sickening spectacle of fake philanthropy. Serena was holding court by an elaborate ice sculpture shaped like a dove. She wore a custom emerald green dress that hugged her figure and sparkled with hundreds of hand-sewn crystals. She was draped in expensive diamonds, playing the role of the perfect charitable hostess. She laughed loudly, tossing her head back as local politicians and wealthy business owners fawned over her every word. My parents stood right beside her, beaming with unearned pride. My mother, Valerie, wore a smug smile as she sipped vintage champagne, completely intoxicated by the proximity to power and high society. She looked at Serena like a prize-winning trophy, but Trent looked like a dead man walking. He was sweating profusely through his stiff white collar. He kept checking his phone every 30 seconds and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his drink. He flinched whenever anyone approached him to ask about his upcoming real estate expansion. He knew the financial walls were closing in on him, but he had absolutely no idea that I held the detonator. At exactly 8 o'clock, the lights in the ballroom dimmed to a soft amber glow. The guests took their seats at their lavishly decorated tables, eagerly awaiting the start of the program. The chairman of the board stepped up to the podium to welcome the prestigious guests. He spoke at length about the incredible work the foundation had done over the past year, praising Serena for her visionary leadership. And then he invited me to the stage to present the annual financial audit. It was supposed to be a routine formality, a boring 5-minute presentation that the guests would sleep through while eating their caviar appetizers. I walked slowly up the carpeted steps and took my place behind the wooden podium. I adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of wealthy, expectant faces. I found Serena sitting at the center table right in the front row. She sat between Trent and my father, radiating arrogance. She caught my eye and rolled her eyes, taking a dramatic sip of her wine. She expected me to quietly validate her charity work and fade back into the shadows. She expected me to remain the obedient, silent scapegoat. I pressed the button on my presentation remote, and the massive projector screen behind me illuminated the entire ballroom with a blinding white light. I did not show them a standard summary of charitable donations. I did not show them heartwarming graphs of community outreach programs. I showed them a highly detailed forensic breakdown of Serena's personal spending. The first slide displayed a massive wire transfer routing $300,000 from the charity's Orphan Relief Fund directly to a luxury car dealership. I spoke clearly into the microphone, explaining that the money meant to provide shelter for homeless children was instead used to purchase a customized imported sports car for the foundation director. A murmur of confusion rippled through the room. I clicked to the next slide. It showed a series of invoices for first-class flights to Dubai, Paris, and Milan, all paid for by the foundation's community development budget. The screen displayed side-by-side comparisons of the charity's bank statements and Serena's public Instagram posts. The photos showed her posing on private jets, sipping champagne on the exact dates the relief funds were withdrawn from the charity bank accounts. The confusion in the room quickly morphed into shocked, outraged whispers. I clicked the remote again. This time the screen filled with receipts for 6 different Hermes Birkin bags and thousands of dollars in designer shoes, all illegally charged to the charity, under the guise of office supplies and administrative expenses. I broke down exactly how Serena and Trent had been embezzling millions of dollars in tax-exempt donation funds to finance their glamorous internet lifestyle. I laid out the entire money laundering scheme step by step, exposing how they used the charity as a personal piggy bank to maintain the illusion of elite wealth while Trent's actual business secretly bled money from every pore. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Wealthy donors began shouting furiously, realizing their generous contributions had bought designer handbags instead of helping the community. The politicians at the front tables stood up and physically backed away from Serena's table, looking horrified and desperate to distance themselves from the unfolding federal scandal. Serena's face drained of all color, turning an awful, sickly gray. Her hands shook violently, and she dropped her crystal wine glass. It shattered against the white tablecloth, spilling red wine everywhere like blood. She looked at Trent for help, her eyes wide with panic, but he was staring blankly at the floor, paralyzed by terror. My parents were completely shell-shocked. The elite society they had sacrificed me to join was now looking at them with absolute disgust. My father, DeAndre, jumped up from his seat, knocking his heavy chair backward onto the marble floor. His face was purple with indignation and denial. He pointed a trembling finger at me, screaming over the noise of the outraged crowd. He shouted that I was lying and that the documents were completely fabricated. He turned to the furious donors and desperately tried to save face. He promised everyone that it was just a massive misunderstanding. He yelled that Trent was a brilliant wealth manager and that Trent would simply repay whatever funds were supposedly missing from the accounts. He was still trying to defend his golden child and his terrible investment. I looked down at my father from the stage and let a cold, empty smile spread across my face. I leaned closely into the microphone so my voice would echo clearly through the chaotic ballroom, overriding his desperate shouts. With what money, I asked, my tone dropping to a dead, chilling calm. The IRS froze all of Trent's accounts this morning. Julian and I sat in our home office staring at the glowing monitors long after the sun came up. Trent was not just a thief, he was a desperate coward who had severely underestimated my husband. In a blind panic after the charity gala, Trent had hired dark web hackers to infiltrate our secure network and destroy the servers holding his financial records. He thought a brute force attack would erase his crimes. But Julian was a leading cybersecurity expert who had built digital fortresses for government contractors. He thwarted the amateur attack in a matter of minutes. Then Julian did what he did best. He reverse-engineered the hack and followed the digital trail straight back to its source. Julian bypassed Trent's pathetic security protocols and downloaded the entire contents of his private encrypted email server. The emails laid out a horrifying exit strategy. Trent knew the IRS freeze was only the beginning. He knew federal agents were preparing arrest warrants. He had no intention of staying in Atlanta to face the consequences of his actions. Trent had spent the last 48 hours liquidating whatever untraceable assets he had left and funneling the cash into an anonymous cryptocurrency wallet. He had booked a seat on a private charter flight leaving for a non-extradition country on Monday morning. The emails revealed his true feelings about his perfect marriage. He referred to Serena as a useful idiot who signed whatever documents he put in front of her. He planned to vanish into the wind, leaving his wife to face the embezzlement charges alone and leaving my parents to absorb the massive financial fallout. My phone vibrated on the desk, breaking the heavy silence in the office. It was a message from my mother, Valerie. The tone was completely different from the self-righteous anger she had displayed at the gala. She begged me to come to Big Mama's house for Sunday dinner. She said the family needed to stick together in times of crisis. She claimed they needed my financial expertise because the bank was calling and asking very uncomfortable questions. I knew exactly what was happening. The federal freeze on Trent's accounts had triggered an automatic default on the massive second mortgage my father had so proudly taken out. The bank was threatening to seize the historic family estate. My parents were panicking, and they needed their discarded daughter to bail them out. I looked at Julian and he simply handed me the thick printed folder of Trent's decoded emails. I drove to Buckhead ready to deliver the final devastating blow. I parked in the circular driveway and walked up the brick steps. The heavy oak front doors were unlocked. The usual comforting smell of expensive catering and fresh flowers was gone. The house felt cold, empty, and hollow. I found my family sitting in the formal dining room. The grand mahogany table was mostly bare except for a few plates of hastily prepared food that no one was eating. My father DeAndre looked like he had aged 10 years in a single weekend. His custom suit was wrinkled and his eyes were bloodshot. My mother sat beside him, wringing her hands nervously and looking terrified. Serena was pacing back and forth near the large bay window. She wore designer loungewear and was aggressively typing on her phone. Trent was suspiciously absent. He was probably finalizing his escape route while his victims sat around waiting for him to save them. My mother stood up when I walked into the room, forcing a fragile, trembling smile. She gestured to an empty chair and told me how glad she was that I came. She said family must forgive each other and put aside petty grievances when things get difficult. I remained standing near the arched doorway, observing their pathetic desperation. My father cleared his throat and actively avoided looking me in the eye. He admitted that the bank had frozen their secondary accounts and they were threatening immediate foreclosure on the estate. He swallowed his massive pride and asked me to transfer funds from my private equity group to save the house. He promised they would pay me back the moment Trent sorted out the terrible misunderstanding with the IRS. They still believed the lie. They still refused to accept the reality of the monster they had embraced. Serena stopped pacing and glared at me across the room. Her face was pale and drawn, but her profound arrogance remained completely intact. She crossed her arms over her chest and told me to stop dragging this out. She demanded I authorize the transfer immediately and do my duty as family. She said I owed them after causing such a humiliating public spectacle at her charity gala. She claimed the entire federal investigation was a witch hunt triggered by my jealous, unhinged accusations. She told me Trent was working around the clock with his lawyers to fix everything and that I just needed to write the check to keep the bank off their backs. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers tap impatiently against her arms. She was facing a lengthy federal prison sentence, and she still thought she could order me around like an obedient servant. I walked slowly toward the dining table. I placed the thick manila folder right next to my father's empty plate. I told them Trent was not working around the clock to fix anything. I told them Trent was currently finalizing his flight plan to a country that does not extradite financial criminals back to the United States. Serena's face twitched with sudden uncertainty. She yelled that I was lying and that Trent was at his downtown office. I opened the folder and spread the printed emails across the polished mahogany table. I told them Julian had reverse-engineered Trent's cyber attack and downloaded his entire encrypted server. I pointed to the flight confirmation and the cryptocurrency transfer receipts. Trent was leaving them all to take the fall. My mother let out a strangled, horrific sob, pulling the papers toward her chest. But the flight logs were not the worst part of the folder. I pulled out a separate stack of bank documents and placed them directly in front of my father. I asked him if he really thought a $2 million mortgage was enough to cover the massive, catastrophic trading losses Trent had incurred. I asked him if he ever bothered to thoroughly check the loan documents he signed when he handed over the deed to Big Mama's house. My father stared at the papers, his hands beginning to shake violently. I explained the true scale of the fraud in a slow, methodical voice that echoed in the quiet room. Trent did not just take out a $2 million second mortgage. He used your personal information and your business tax identification numbers to secure an additional $5 million commercial loan. He forged both of your signatures on the guarantor agreements to bypass the credit checks. He funneled that entire $5 million directly through your personal accounts to clean the money before moving it to his offshore shell companies. You are not just facing the foreclosure of this house. You are completely bankrupt. The bank owns everything, including your business assets and your retirement portfolios. And because the stolen money moved directly through your personal accounts, The federal government views you as active co-conspirators in a massive money laundering operation. You are facing federal conspiracy charges and probable prison time. The silence in the dining room was absolute and suffocating. My father clutched his chest, gasping for air, as the reality of his total financial ruin and impending arrest set in. My mother buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her elite social standing evaporated into thin air. Serena stared blindly at the forged signatures on the loan agreements, her arrogant, flawless facade finally shattering into a million jagged pieces. They had sacrificed my happiness and my peace to protect their golden child and her perfect wealthy husband. And in return, their golden child had helped burn their entire legacy to the ground. I turned around and walked out of the dining room, leaving them surrounded by the undeniable proof of their own total destruction. I drove away from the sprawling estate in Buckhead, feeling a strange, profound sense of absolute liberation. The heavy, crushing burden of trying to earn my parents' love and respect had finally been lifted from my shoulders entirely. They had willingly handed over the deed to our family legacy to a man who was running a massive financial scam. They had chosen their golden child and their fake prestige over my warnings and my loyalty. I navigated my car through the dark, winding streets of the wealthy suburbs and headed toward the city center. My phone vibrated on the passenger seat with a message from Julian. He told me to bring the physical copies of the bank records straight to the secure vault at my downtown office building. The streets of Atlanta were quiet and mostly empty on a Sunday night. I felt no remorse for the people I had left behind in that dining room. They had chosen their path, and now they had to walk it. I pulled my car into the underground parking garage of my corporate office building. It was late, and the massive concrete cavern was completely deserted. The fluorescent tube lights buzzed loudly overhead, casting long, harsh shadows across the rows of empty parking spaces. I parked my car near the VIP elevator bank and gathered the heavy manila folders from the passenger seat. I locked my car and started walking toward the glass doors, holding the documents tightly against my chest. My footsteps echoed loudly against the thick concrete walls, creating a rhythmic drumming sound in the empty space. Suddenly, the violent squeal of tires shattered the quiet atmosphere of the garage. A dark sedan sped around the concrete corner, drifting wildly before slamming to a halt, directly blocking my path to the elevators. The smell of burning rubber filled the damp air. The driver's side door flew open, and Trent stumbled out into the dim fluorescent light. He looked absolutely deranged, and nothing like the slick, arrogant wealth manager who had charmed his way into my family. His expensive, custom-tailored suit was torn at the shoulder and heavily stained with dark patches of sweat. His silk tie was hanging loosely around his unbuttoned collar, and his eyes were wide, frantic, and severely bloodshot. He had clearly been waiting for me, tracking my movements through the city. He marched toward me, his chest heaving with erratic, desperate breaths. I stopped walking and stood my ground, maintaining my composure as he aggressively blocked the entrance to the elevator bay. He demanded to know what I had told my parents and what evidence I had given them. He screamed that I was ruining everything he had worked so hard to build over the past decade. He paced back and forth in front of me, running his trembling hands through his greasy, disheveled hair. He said the federal agents were already swarming his downtown office, seizing his computers, and freezing his offshore backup accounts. He blamed me entirely for the catastrophic collapse of his fraudulent empire. He refused to take even a single ounce of responsibility for the millions of dollars he had ruthlessly stolen from innocent clients and charitable foundations. Trent stopped his manic pacing and stared at me with wild, terrified eyes. He tried to force himself to calm down, attempting to slip back into his familiar, smooth-talking salesman persona. His voice kept cracking with undeniable panic as he took a step closer to me. He told me we could easily work out a mutually beneficial arrangement to make all of this disappear. He said he knew Julian was a brilliant hacker, but every digital trail could eventually be erased if the right person deleted the root files. He offered me a $2 million bribe in untraceable cryptocurrency to log into the Foundation servers and wipe the entire audit history clean. He begged me to permanently destroy the forensic accounting report I had presented at the charity gala. He promised to transfer the anonymous funds to any offshore wallet of my choosing the very second the files were deleted. He said with that kind of money, Julian and I could retire early and live out our days like royalty on a tropical island. He even had the nerve to tell me I owed him a favor for taking Serena off my hands and elevating my family's social status in the local elite circles. The sheer audacity of his request was staggering to witness. He was offering to bribe me with the exact same funds he had stolen from my sister and my parents. I looked him dead in the eye and told him his stolen money was completely worthless to me. I told him there was absolutely no deal to be made and that he was going to spend the rest of his natural life rotting inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. Trent's face twisted into a horrifying mask of pure unhinged rage. My blunt rejection snapped the very last fragile thread of his sanity. He reached into the waistband of his tailored trousers and pulled out a heavy black handgun. He raised his right arm and pointed the barrel directly at my chest. The cold metal of the weapon glinted dangerously under the buzzing fluorescent lights above us. His hand was shaking so badly I thought he might accidentally pull the trigger in his panic. He stepped closer until the gun was less than 3 feet away from my body. He told me I was a stupid, arrogant woman who did not know when to simply back down and accept a good deal. He said he had absolutely nothing left to lose because his entire life was already destroyed by my meddling. He threatened to end my life right there in the cold, empty concrete garage if I did not immediately pull out my laptop and wipe the servers. He screamed that he was not going to let a jealous, miserable accountant send him to federal prison. The deafening echo of his shouts bounced off the thick concrete walls, creating a terrifying symphony of violence and desperate cowardice. I stood perfectly still in the face of his deadly threat. I did not flinch or cower. I did not step back or drop the folders holding the evidence of his crimes. I looked directly past the dark barrel of the gun and stared deep into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. A profound, icy calm settled over my entire body because I knew something he did not. I slowly raised my left hand and tapped the small wireless earpiece hidden carefully beneath my hair. I spoke clearly and deliberately into the hidden microphone. I told Trent that Julian knew exactly what kind of violent coward he was behind closed doors. I explained that Julian had anticipated this exact level of pathetic desperation the moment the accounts were frozen. I told him Julian had hacked his car navigation system and bugged his mobile devices hours ago, tracking his every move across the city. I watched Trent's eyes widen in absolute horror as the crushing realization slowly washed over him. I smiled, my voice echoing confidently through the silent parking garage. I informed him that every single word he had just spoken was currently being transmitted. I told him the $2 million bribery attempt, the full confession of his financial crimes, and the active threat with a deadly weapon were broadcasting live to a Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes task force. The remaining color drained completely from Trent's face, leaving him looking like a terrified hollow shell of a man. The gun trembled violently in his grip, before he slowly lowered it toward the ground, his strength evaporating. He looked around the empty parking garage as if expecting federal agents to drop down from the concrete ceiling. In the distance, the faint but unmistakable wail of police sirens began to echo down the concrete ramp. The approaching sound broke his paralysis. Trent dropped the heavy gun on the concrete floor with a loud metallic clatter. He turned around and ran frantically into the darkness, fleeing the scene like a frightened animal. I stood alone in the bright fluorescent light, listening to the sirens grow louder, knowing the cyber hunt was over and the net had finally closed. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers flooded the dark concrete walls of the parking garage as armed federal agents swarmed the lower levels. I stood calmly by my car and pointed them toward the exit ramp where Trent had fled, leaving his heavy black handgun lying uselessly on the cold floor. The lead FBI agent secured the weapon while another team rushed upstairs to lock down Trent's office and seize his remaining physical servers. I handed over the encrypted hard drive containing all the downloaded emails, the forged loan documents, and the offshore bank routing numbers. Julian had already sent them the live audio file of the bribery attempt and the death threat. My part in the physical takedown was over, so I got into my car and drove home through the quiet city streets feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. The monster was finally on the run with no money and nowhere to hide. The next morning, the news broke across every local network and financial blog in Atlanta. The authorities had raided the charity headquarters and Trent's wealth management firm simultaneously. The morning anchors looked stunned as they detailed the massive embezzlement ring, the forged signatures, and the fake charitable accounts connected to the city's most beloved socialite couple. But the most satisfying headline was the federal manhunt for Trent. He had managed to slip past the initial airport security perimeter, but his private charter was grounded, and he was currently a fugitive running out of options. He had completely abandoned his perfect wife, leaving her holding the bag for a multi-million-dollar federal fraud case. Julian and I sat in our kitchen drinking coffee and watching the live news helicopters circle Big Mama's house in Buckhead. My parents were trapped inside with the horrifying realization that they were entirely bankrupt, and their golden child was about to be indicted. I knew it was only a matter of time before the cornered rats started turning on each other. I did not have to wait long. Later that afternoon, the security buzzer at my front gate chimed persistently. Julian checked the camera feed and raised his eyebrows. It was Serena. She was completely alone, and she looked absolutely unhinged. I told Julian to let her in. I wanted to see the final stage of her desperation. I opened the front door and watched my sister stumble up the paved walkway. The glamorous high society philanthropist was completely gone. She was wearing oversized dark sunglasses to hide her swollen red eyes, and her expensive silk clothes looked like she had slept in them. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled mess, and her hands were shaking violently as she practically fell into my living room. She collapsed onto my sofa and burst into loud theatrical sobs. She did not yell or demand money like she had at the fatal Sunday dinner. The arrogant entitlement had been entirely stripped away by the threat of federal prison. Instead, she slid off the sofa and crawled across the hardwood floor on her hands and knees. She grabbed onto my legs, weeping hysterically and begging for mercy. It was the most pathetic display of manipulation I had ever witnessed. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her ruined face and swore she had absolutely no idea what Trent was doing behind her back. She sobbed that he had lied to her and used her charity as a shield without her permission or knowledge. She claimed she was terrified of his temper and that he had forced her to sign all those offshore banking documents under extreme emotional duress. She desperately clung to my ankles, weeping and playing the ultimate victim card. She begged me to call the FBI and tell them she was innocent. She told me to look at the power dynamic between them. She claimed she was just a naive, innocent black woman who had been completely manipulated and financially abused by a powerful, wealthy white man. She said Trent had used his Boston old money charm to blind our parents and trap her in a fraudulent marriage where she had no real control. She cried that she was just a pawn in his sick corporate game, and that I had to protect my sister from going to federal prison because the justice system would show a woman of color no mercy. She swore she never wanted to hurt me or take the family estate, and that every cruel thing she had ever done was heavily influenced by Trent's toxic manipulation. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping woman clutching my legs. I felt absolutely no sympathy for her. I reached down and peeled her trembling fingers off my clothes, stepping back to create a physical distance between us. I told her she was a phenomenal actress, but the performance was entirely wasted on me. I walked over to the smart speakers sitting on my console table. I told Serena that when Julian hacked Trent's encrypted server, he did not just find the exit strategy and the flight plans to a non-extradition country. He also found a hidden cache of recorded phone calls. Trent was so paranoid and untrusting of his own wife that he automatically recorded every single conversation they had on his private network. I looked at Serena's tear-stained face as the realization slowly dawned on her. Her sobbing abruptly stopped, and her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. I tapped the top of the smart speaker and instructed it to play the audio file labeled Buckhead Mortgage. The crisp, clear sound of Serena's own voice filled my quiet living room. There was no fear or manipulation in her recorded tone, just cold, calculating greed and malicious intent. She was not crying or acting like a naive victim on the recording. She was actively instructing Trent on how to forge our parents' signatures on the commercial loan documents. The recording played her exact words telling Trent that our father was too stupid and too desperate for validation to read the fine print, and that they needed to secure the $5 million payout immediately before the bank noticed the discrepancies. The audio continued, revealing the true depth of her depravity. Serena explicitly stated on the recording that they could use the stolen cash from our parents' ruined estate to finally purchase the massive private luxury yacht she had picked out for their escape. She laughed cruelly on the tape describing the teak wood decks and the full catering staff they would hire when they relocated to the Grand Cayman Islands, leaving our parents homeless and destitute. I crossed my arms and watched my sister stop breathing as she listened to herself plotting the total financial destruction of our family just to buy a boat. The silence that followed the recording was heavier than a tombstone. Serena stared at the speaker, her mouth opening and closing, without making a sound, completely trapped in the prison of her own making. I told her the FBI already had a copy of this exact recording. I watched her eyes dart wildly around the room as she realized there was no scapegoat left to blame. The innocent victim routine had failed. The blame shifting had failed. She had willingly participated in the destruction of everything my parents held dear, and she had done it with a smile on her face. I walked over to the front door and opened it wide. I told her to get out of my house before I called the police to report a trespasser. Serena slowly pushed herself off the floor, looking like a hollow ghost. She stumbled out the door into the harsh afternoon sunlight, finally understanding that her perfect golden life was officially over. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind Serena, leaving my house in absolute total peace. Julian walked into the living room and stood beside me, watching through the front window as my sister stumbled down the paved driveway. She looked like a broken doll, her perfect life completely shattered by the weight of her own malicious greed. I felt no guilt and absolutely no regret. She had built her entire existence on a foundation of lies and manipulation, and now the ground had simply swallowed her whole. She thought she could play the innocent victim, but the audio recording had completely destroyed her final desperate illusion. Over the next few weeks, the federal investigation moved with ruthless efficiency. The authorities unraveled the massive complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts tying everything back to the forged loan documents. The bank moved aggressively to recoup their staggering financial losses. They froze all remaining assets tied to my parents' names and initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on Big Mama's house. The historic Buckhead estate was the ultimate symbol of our family legacy. It was the physical embodiment of the wealth and prestige my parents cared about above all else. Now it was scheduled for a public auction on the steps of the county courthouse. 2 days before the auction, my parents showed up at my corporate office building. They bypassed the reception desk and ambushed me near the private elevators. My father, DeAndre, looked like a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant patriarch he used to be. His expensive tailored suits hung loosely on his shrinking frame, and his hands trembled violently as he reached out to grab my arm. My mother, Valerie, was weeping openly, her face devoid of the expensive cosmetics she usually wore like armor. They looked completely pathetic and utterly broken. They begged me to save their home. They pleaded with me to use my private equity connections to pay off the bank and stop the public sale. My father actually fell to his knees on the polished marble floor, sobbing. That Big Mama's house was the only piece of our history they had left. He said he would do anything if I just gave them a financial bailout. He promised to make things right and treat me with the respect I had always deserved. I looked down at the man who had gladly signed away my inheritance to a criminal just to maintain his elite status. I looked at the mother who had called me a miserable failure in front of hundreds of people. I pulled my arm away and told them they had gambled their legacy on a massive fraud. I told them I would not spend a single cent of my hard-earned money to bail out their profound stupidity. I walked onto the elevator and left them weeping on the cold marble floor. The morning of the auction was bitterly cold and heavily overcast. A sharp, freezing wind whipped through the downtown streets as a small crowd gathered at the base of the massive stone courthouse steps. Julian and I stood quietly near the back of the plaza, observing the real estate vultures circling the remains of my parents' empire. My mother and father stood huddled together near the front row, looking completely devastated as the bank representatives prepared the legal paperwork. They were hoping for a miracle that I knew would never come. The auctioneer stepped up to the wooden podium and announced the opening bid for the historic estate. The starting price was an absolute fraction of what the massive property was actually worth. The bank just wanted to clear the bad debt and move on. As the aggressive bidding began, I noticed a sleek black town car pull up to the curb just outside the busy plaza. The rear tinted window rolled down a few inches, and I saw a familiar face hiding in the shadows. It was Trent. He was still technically a fugitive, but he was desperate enough to risk showing his face in public. He had sent a proxy bidder to the auction to do his dirty work. A tall man in a sharp charcoal suit stood confidently near the auctioneer, waiting for the right moment. Trent had clearly managed to access some of his hidden cryptocurrency reserves, and he was using this shadowy investor to buy the house for pennies on the dollar. It was a brilliant and utterly sickening money laundering scheme. He planned to purchase the foreclosed property through an anonymous corporate entity, effectively cleaning his stolen cash while simultaneously keeping the estate out of my parents' hands. The proxy bidder immediately raised his paddle, throwing out an aggressive bid that silenced the casual real estate flippers in the crowd. My parents watched in pure horror as the man in the charcoal suit dominated the auction. They did not know the man was working for the very criminal who had destroyed their lives. They only knew their family home was slipping away into the hands of a ruthless corporate developer. My mother buried her face in my father's chest, weeping loudly as the proxy bidder casually raised the price, pushing out the last remaining local investor. The man in the charcoal suit turned and offered a subtle nod toward the tinted windows of the black town car. Trent was gloating from the shadows, thinking he had outsmarted the federal agents and secured a massive clean asset to fund his eventual escape. He thought his dark web funds had saved him from total ruin. The auctioneer raised his heavy wooden gavel, calling out for any final bids on the historic property. He announced going once, and the crowd remained completely silent. My parents held on to each other, sobbing uncontrollably as their legacy prepared to change hands forever. The auctioneer announced going twice, and the proxy bidder smiled, adjusting his expensive silk tie. I stood perfectly still with my hands resting deeply in the pockets of my long wool coat. I looked at Julian, and he gave me a subtle, affirming nod. The trap was finally set, and it was time to close the jaws. Just as the auctioneer raised the gavel for the final time, a clear, authoritative voice cut through the freezing wind. A woman standing near the front row raised her bright yellow paddle and called out a number that was exactly $500,000 higher than Trent's proxy. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. The proxy bidder whipped his head around, his confident smile vanishing instantly in a cloud of confusion. He stared at the mysterious woman in absolute shock and quickly tapped an earpiece hidden in his ear, clearly asking Trent for emergency instructions. He raised his paddle and countered the offer, trying to regain control of the floor. The woman immediately fired back with another crushing bid, raising the price by an additional $1 million. The aggressive, massive counteroffer completely destroyed whatever hidden liquidity Trent had managed to scrape together from his offshore accounts. He could not compete with that kind of legitimate financial firepower. The man in the charcoal suit stood frozen, listening to the frantic, desperate commands echoing in his earpiece. He slowly lowered his paddle and shook his head, stepping back into the crowd in total, absolute defeat. The black town car at the curb suddenly lurched forward and sped away down the street, running a red light as Trent realized his final, desperate money laundering scheme had utterly failed. My parents stared at the mysterious woman with wide, tear-filled eyes, wondering who had just purchased their ancestral home and ripped it away from the developer's grasp. The auctioneer brought the heavy wooden gavel down with a loud, definitive crack, securing the sale for the highest bidder. He formally asked the woman for the legal name of the purchasing entity. She calmly opened her leather briefcase and handed over a thick stack of certified bank drafts. She turned slightly toward the crowd and announced loudly that the winning bidder was a private, anonymous blind trust. The stunned silence that followed my attorney's announcement on the courthouse steps was absolute. The bank representatives eagerly accepted the certified drafts from our blind trust, completely unconcerned with family drama as long as the massive debt was cleared. My parents stood trembling in the freezing wind, watching their historic legacy get signed away to a nameless, faceless corporate entity. They had absolutely no idea that the trust was entirely controlled by Julian and me. They turned and walked away from the plaza, looking like two hollow ghosts, shuffling back to a reality where they had absolutely nothing left. Julian squeezed my hand as we watched them leave. We did not celebrate or gloat, because the true final blow was still waiting to be delivered. The house was only collateral damage in a much larger war. The real target was Trent and his fraudulent financial empire. Monday morning brought a heavy gray rain that washed over the slick glass skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta. Trent had somehow managed to avoid federal custody over the weekend, likely cowering in some luxury hotel paid for with whatever cash he had in his pockets. Despite being a cornered fugitive, his profound arrogance remained entirely intact. He had called an emergency board meeting at his wealth management firm for 9 a.m. He was desperate, but he was also a master manipulator who actually believed he could still talk his way out of a federal indictment. He thought he could convince his board of directors that the missing millions were just temporary accounting errors, and that his shadowy offshore investor was going to inject enough capital to save the firm and silence the auditors. Julian and I sat in the leather seats of my car parked across the street from Trent's corporate building. We watched through the rain-slicked windows as Trent practically sprinted through the revolving glass doors flanked by 2 expensive defense attorneys. His suit was rumpled and he kept looking over his shoulder, paranoid that federal agents were waiting in the lobby. I looked down at the thick leather portfolio resting on my lap. It contained the finalized legal documents transferring majority ownership of his entire firm directly into my hands. The $2 million bribe he had tried to offer me in the parking garage was nothing compared to the legitimate leverage Julian and I had acquired by purchasing his toxic debt through our anonymous trust. We waited exactly 20 minutes to ensure the emergency board meeting was fully underway before we entered the building. We bypassed the reception desk and took the private executive elevator straight to the top floor. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom were closed, but I could hear Trent's panicked voice echoing through the corridor. He was frantically trying to reassure his furious partners and the angry board members. He was weaving a pathetic web of lies, promising them that a massive wire transfer was currently clearing international customs and would cover all the missing client funds by noon. He swore that the charity embezzlement rumors were just the jealous ramblings of his unhinged sister-in-law. I did not bother knocking. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and walked directly into the center of the massive glass-walled boardroom, with Julian close behind me. The sudden interruption caused the entire room to fall completely silent. 12 senior partners and board members turned to stare at us in utter confusion. Trent stopped speaking mid-sentence, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He gripped the edge of the polished conference table, his knuckles turning stark white as his bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. His initial shock quickly morphed into a desperate manic rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me and demanded that security be called immediately to remove a trespassing civilian. He yelled that I was a psychotic liar trying to ruin his business, and that I had absolutely no right to step foot on his corporate floor. He commanded his partners to ignore my presence, claiming I was the reason the federal authorities were currently auditing their accounts. Before the bewildered security guard could even step forward, the chairman of the board raised his hand and told Trent to sit down and shut his mouth. The chairman was an older, distinguished man who looked absolutely exhausted by Trent's erratic behavior. He turned to me with a cautious, respectful nod and asked why I had interrupted an emergency closed-door corporate proceeding. I walked slowly to the head of the conference table, completely ignoring Trent's frantic demands for me to leave. I placed the heavy leather portfolio directly in front of the chairman. I introduced myself clearly and calmly, making sure every single powerful executive in that room heard my name. I told them that they were wasting their time listening to Trent's empty promises, because his phantom offshore investor was never going to wire them a single cent. I explained that Trent had completely bankrupted his own private accounts, trying to buy my parents' foreclosed mansion through a proxy bidder to launder his stolen cash. I watched the board members exchange horrified glances as the true depth of his criminal liability was laid bare in front of them. Trent slammed his fists on the table, screaming that I was making up insane conspiracy theories. He swore to the board that his investor was real and that the capital injection was guaranteed. I looked at him with absolute freezing contempt and told him the investor was never real. I told the entire room that Julian and I were the sole directors of the anonymous blind trust that had outbid his proxy at the courthouse auction. I explained that we had not just purchased my parents' historic estate, we had systematically bought up every single piece of toxic debt Trent's firm had desperately tried to offload over the past 48 hours. The chairman opened the leather portfolio and rapidly scanned the verified legal documents confirming the transfer of ownership. His eyes widened in shock as he realized the full reality of their situation. I told the board that by purchasing the overwhelming majority of their defaulting debt, my trust was now the primary controlling shareholder of the entire wealth management firm. The panicked whispers around the mahogany table grew louder as the executives realized they were no longer answering to Trent. They were answering directly to the woman he had spent years trying to destroy. Trent collapsed back into his leather chair, looking like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. I walked around the table until I was standing directly behind Trent's chair, looking out at the captive audience of executives. I told them that my first official act as majority shareholder was a complete and total restructuring of the executive board. I pointed out the falsified revenue reports, the forged guarantor agreements from my parents, and the offshore accounts Trent had desperately tried to hide. I laid out the undeniable proof that their so-called brilliant founder was nothing more than a pathetic common thief who had used their prestigious firm as a personal piggy bank. Trent tried to speak, but his voice was reduced to a pathetic broken whisper. He looked up at me with tears welling in his red eyes, begging me not to do this to him. He whispered that he had built this company from nothing and that it was his entire life. I looked down at the man who had gladly ruined my sister, bankrupted my parents, and threatened my life in a dark parking garage. I felt no mercy for the monster sitting in front of me. I leaned in close so only he could hear my next words. I told him he was nothing but a coward who built a castle out of stolen sand, and now the tide had finally come in. I straightened my posture and addressed the silent boardroom with total authority. I formally announced that Trent was immediately and irrevocably terminated from his position as Chief Executive Officer. I stripped him of all corporate privileges, revoked his access to the building, and informed the board that our attorneys would be handing his entire digital server history directly over to the federal investigators waiting in the lobby. I turned to the security guard standing near the door and quietly instructed him to escort the former CEO off the premises. Trent did not fight back or scream as the guard pulled him out of his chair. He walked out of the glass boardroom a completely broken, ruined man, leaving me standing victorious at the head of the empire he had stolen to build. Julian and I followed the security guards down the private executive elevator, leaving the stunned boardroom completely behind us. The heavy metallic doors slid open to reveal the expansive glass-enclosed lobby of the wealth management firm. The scene waiting for us was a picture of absolute chaos. The federal investigators I had mentioned were already blocking the main exits, holding thick manila folders and gold badges. But they were not alone. Standing near the center of the cold marble floor were my parents and my sister. They must have driven straight from the courthouse auction to demand answers from the man who was supposed to save them. They looked like a pathetic portrait of ruined high society standing nervously in their wrinkled designer clothes. Trent was shoved out of the adjacent elevator bay by the building security team. His expensive suit jacket was half off his shoulder, and his usually immaculate hair was matted with dark, nervous sweat. Serena let out a sharp, desperate gasp and ran toward him, her designer heels clicking loudly against the polished marble. She grabbed his arm, weeping and demanding to know what was happening and why his proxy bidder had failed to buy back Big Mama's house. My father DeAndre followed closely behind her, his face a mask of panicked confusion. He grabbed Trent's other arm and loudly demanded a massive wire transfer to satisfy the bank, claiming their pristine family name was currently being dragged through the mud. Trent stood completely paralyzed in the middle of the lobby, surrounded by federal agents and clutching in-laws. He looked past their desperate, tear-stained faces and locked his wild, bloodshot eyes directly on me as I stepped out of the elevator with Julian. He finally understood the absolute finality of his situation. There was no hidden offshore account waiting for him to access. There was no private jet ready on a secluded runway to take him to a tropical paradise. There was no multi-million-dollar firm to hide behind anymore. He was completely and utterly bankrupt in every sense of the word. His entire carefully constructed life had been dismantled brick by brick, and I was holding the only key to his destruction. The realization snapped something deep and primal inside his brain. The charming Boston elite persona. The polite, wealthy son-in-law who had completely fooled the upper crust of Atlanta shattered into a million jagged pieces, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated venom. Trent violently ripped his arms away from Serena and my father, sending them stumbling backward across the cold marble floor. He let out a guttural sound that was half laugh and half scream. The heavy, suffocating silence in the lobby amplified his voice as he finally let his true colors show for everyone to see. He pointed a shaking finger at my father and unleashed a torrent of vicious, racially charged insults that made the entire room freeze in absolute horror. He called DeAndre a pathetic, desperate old man who was so eager for white validation and proximity to old money that he practically handed over the keys to his entire legacy without ever bothering to read a single loan document. He mocked my father's expensive country club memberships and his custom-tailored suits, telling him he would always be just a stupid, gullible mark playing dress-up in a world where he never truly belonged, and where everyone was secretly laughing at him behind his back. My mother, Valerie gasped, placing her trembling hands over her mouth as the racist vitriol spilled from the mouth of the man she had literally worshipped and elevated above her own blood. Trent turned his furious, hateful gaze to her and laughed, a cold, cruel sound that echoed off the glass walls. He called her an ignorant social climbing parasite who gladly sold out her own flesh and blood just to brag to her equally pathetic friends that she had a wealthy white son-in-law. He said her pathetic desperation to fit in with the Atlanta elite made her the easiest mark of his entire criminal career. Then he stepped toward Serena, who was cowering near the massive marble reception desk. He looked down at his glamorous, flawless wife, with pure, undisguised disgust marring his features. He called Serena an empty-brained gold digger, a completely useless idiot who was only good for signing fraudulent tax returns and serving as his diverse trophy wife to appease the liberal charity boards and federal regulators. He said the only reason he ever married into their pathetic black family was because they were so desperate for his white wealth that they willingly ignored every single blazing red flag he waved in their faces. The sheer hatred radiating from him was suffocating and vile, poisoning the air in the lobby. He used brutal, unrepeatable slurs and derogatory terms that hit my parents like physical blows. He told them he had secretly despised them from the very first day he stepped foot in Big Mama's house, feeling nothing but contempt for their history and their culture. He mocked the history of our ancestral estate, calling it a worthless pile of bricks that he was absolutely thrilled to leverage and destroy for his own personal gain, just to fund his exit strategy. He stood there in the center of the room, completely stripped of his power and his stolen money, vomiting years of hidden bigotry and deep-seated racism onto the very people who had blindly protected him. My father stood entirely paralyzed, his chest heaving as the horrific reality of what he had done finally crushed the last remaining ounce of his pride. He had traded his loyal, dutiful daughter for a racist monster who viewed his entire existence as a convenient financial joke. The devastating weight of his own profound stupidity seemed to physically crush him, making his broad shoulders sag and his knees tremble uncontrollably. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably, her wails echoing in the large room, unable to process the viciousness of the man she had fiercely defended at my expense. They were finally seeing the true face of the God they had chosen to worship. I stood quietly beside Julian, watching the devastating scene unfold with absolute cold detachment. Trent turned his frantic, hateful eyes back to me, preparing to hurl another stream of desperate insults, but he never got the chance. The lead federal investigator stepped forward, signaling the absolute end of the terrible show. Two heavily armed agents flanked Trent, immediately grabbing his arms and forcefully pinning them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the quiet lobby, cutting off Trent's racist tirade. The agent loudly read Trent his Miranda rights, listing off a staggering string of federal charges, including wire fraud, money laundering, and interstate flight to avoid prosecution. Trent thrashed against their grip, screaming and spitting like a feral animal as they dragged him roughly toward the revolving glass doors, parading his humiliation for the entire world to see. My mother collapsed onto a leather lobby bench, sobbing hysterically into her hands as her golden child's husband was hauled out to a waiting federal transport vehicle. Serena slid down the glass wall of the reception desk, clutching her knees to her chest and staring blankly into space, her mind completely broken. Her flawless fake world was completely gone, and she was facing a guaranteed federal indictment for her active role in the mortgage fraud and the embezzlement scheme. My father stood frozen in the center of the marble floor, looking like a man who had just watched his own soul being ripped apart and burned to ash. He slowly turned his head and met my eyes across the distance. There was no arrogance left in his gaze, no entitlement, and no pride, just a profound, devastating shame. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and apologize for the monster he had brought into our lives and the absolute destruction he had caused. I simply turned my back on him without saying a single word. I linked my arm through Julian's, and we walked out of the building, stepping into the cool, cleansing rain, leaving them all behind in the permanent wreckage of their own making. We stepped through the revolving glass doors and onto the slick pavement, just as the flashing red and blue lights of multiple federal vehicles swarmed the corporate plaza. The heavy gray rain continued to wash over the city, but it did nothing to deter the sudden chaotic influx of local news vans and aggressive reporters. The media had clearly been tipped off about the massive federal raid happening at one of Atlanta's most prestigious wealth management firms. The air was thick with the sound of roaring engines and shouting journalists scrambling to set up their heavy camera equipment in the freezing downpour. Julian opened a large black umbrella and pulled me close to his side, shielding me from the driving rain as we stood near the edge of the plaza. We had a perfect, unobstructed view of the building's main entrance, and I was not going to miss the final act of this tragedy. I had waited far too long to watch their empire of lies finally burn to the ground. The cold wind whipped around us, but I felt incredibly warm inside, knowing that the truth was finally coming to light. The heavy glass doors slid open and the blinding chaotic flashes of dozens of cameras illuminated the dark morning. Two federal agents marched Trent out into the freezing rain, his hands securely fastened behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. The media instantly descended upon him like a pack of starving wolves, shouting frantic questions about the missing millions, the forged documents, and the offshore accounts. Trent looked absolutely pathetic. The rain instantly plastered his thinning hair to his forehead, and his expensive tailored suit was completely soaked and ruined, sticking to his shrinking frame. He frantically tried to duck his head to hide his face from the relentless camera lenses, but the agents offered him absolutely no cover. They marched him right down the center of the wet stone steps, parading him in front of the local news networks that had once praised him as a brilliant financial genius. The arrogant, ruthless man who had threatened to destroy my life was now nothing more than a humiliated, trembling criminal being shoved roughly into the back of a damp federal transport van. The heavy metal doors slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate forever. Moments later, Serena burst through the doors, flanked by my devastated parents. She took one look at the swarm of cameras and the blinding flashes, and her entire demeanor instantly shifted. She wiped away the genuine panic from her face and immediately flipped the switch to play the tragic innocent victim. It was a performance she had perfected over a lifetime of avoiding consequences and shifting the blame onto anyone else. She practically threw herself toward the closest news camera, weeping beautifully and clutching her chest as if her heart was physically breaking. She wailed loudly over the sound of the rain, claiming that she was completely heartbroken and blindsided by her husband's actions. She told the reporters that she was just a dedicated philanthropist, a loving wife who spent her days running her charity foundation, and that she had absolutely no idea where Trent was hiding his stolen money. She played the clueless, wealthy housewife role perfectly, batting her tear-soaked eyelashes and begging the public for privacy and understanding during this devastating family crisis. She honestly thought her pretty face and her practiced tears would save her one last time. But her pathetic performance was brutally cut short. A female federal agent with a sharp, cold expression stepped directly into the frame of the news cameras and blocked Serena's path. The agent did not flinch as Serena tried to push past her, playing the role of the overwhelmed socialite needing to escape the press. Instead, the agent reached into her dark jacket pocket and produced a thick, folded document, handing it directly to my sister. Serena stared at the paper in total confusion, her fake tears instantly drying up as her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble. The female agent spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring that every single reporter and microphone in the plaza caught her exact words. She informed Serena that she was being placed under immediate arrest. She listed the charges with absolute cold precision: grand larceny, wire fraud, and massive charity embezzlement. The agent made sure the entire world knew that my sister was not an innocent bystander, but an active, eager participant in the destruction of countless innocent lives. Serena's flawless jaw dropped open in absolute pure terror. She tried to back away, shaking her head and stammering that there must be some kind of mistake because she was just the charity director and she did not understand finance. The agent coldly informed her that the federal auditors had already tracked the stolen client funds flowing directly through her so-called charitable foundation and right into her personal offshore accounts. There was no mistake, and there was no escape from the meticulous paper trail she had left behind. Another agent stepped forward and roughly pulled Serena's arms behind her back. The harsh metallic snap of the handcuffs echoed through the rain, closing around my sister's wrists with brutal finality. Serena let out a genuine blood-curdling scream, her expensive designer dress getting soaked in the dirty puddles as she thrashed wildly against the agents. She shrieked for our father to do something, to call his lawyers to make the nightmare stop. She begged the reporters to stop filming her humiliation, but there was nothing anyone could do to save her now. She was hauled away, kicking and screaming, into the cold, gray morning. My mother stood on the top step, watching her golden child, her perfect, beautiful daughter getting shoved into a federal vehicle in front of the entire city. The sheer magnitude of the public humiliation and the total destruction of their precious social status was finally too much for her fragile reality to bear. Valerie let out a weak, breathless gasp, her eyes rolling back in her head before she collapsed, completely fainting onto the hard, wet pavement. The remaining reporters scrambled to capture the dramatic scene of the fallen matriarch, her expensive handbag spilling its contents into the rain. My father dropped to his knees beside her, looking older and more broken than I had ever seen him. His entire legacy, his wealth, his pristine reputation, and his beloved family were completely obliterated in a single morning. The empire he cared about more than his own integrity had been reduced to a spectacular public joke. He looked up through the heavy driving rain and spotted me standing quietly under the umbrella with Julian. DeAndre scrambled up from the pavement, leaving my unconscious mother behind, and stumbled down the stone steps toward me. His clothes were ruined, and he was openly weeping, his tears mixing with the cold rain streaming down his face. He fell heavily to his knees right in front of me, splashing dirty water onto my shoes. He looked up at me with desperate, begging eyes, completely shattered and stripped of all his former arrogance. He pleaded with me, crying out that I was his only hope left in the world. He begged me to use the millions in my blind trust to pay Serena's bail, to hire the absolute best defense attorneys, and to save their family name from total, permanent ruin. He swore he would make it up to me, promising to give me the respect, the validation, and the love I had always deserved if I just saved them one last time. He clawed at the air, begging for a daughter he had never truly wanted. I looked down at the man kneeling in the dirty puddles at my feet. I looked at the father who had gladly sacrificed my future and my happiness just to protect his own selfish pride and elevate a criminal over his own blood. I did not feel any anger anymore, and I certainly did not feel an ounce of pity for his pathetic tears. After a lifetime of yearning for his approval, I finally realized that his validation was completely worthless. I felt absolutely nothing at all looking at the broken shell of the patriarch he used to be. I calmly reached forward with my free hand and smoothed down the lapel of my tailored blazer, adjusting it perfectly against the damp chill of the morning air. I looked directly into his desperate, weeping eyes, watching him hold his breath in anticipation of a rescue that would never ever come. I did not smile, and I did not raise my voice. I simply said no. I turned around, walked to my waiting car, and finally drove away from them forever. I linked my arm through Julian's, and we walked out of the building, stepping into the cool, cleansing rain, leaving them all behind, in the permanent wreckage of their own making. The drive back to my office was quiet, but it felt incredibly light. For the first time in my life, the suffocating weight of my parents' expectations and my sister's toxic shadow was completely gone. The local news networks were already running the breaking footage of Trent's arrest by the time we parked. They showed the dramatic clip of Serena screaming as federal agents shoved her into the back of an unmarked transport vehicle, her designer dress soaked and ruined in the Atlanta rain. 3 days later, the final eviction notice for the historic Buckhead estate officially expired. The bank had given my parents exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises before the new anonymous owners took physical possession. The media circus surrounding Trent's massive fraud scheme and Serena's subsequent indictment had completely frozen my parents out of their elite social circles. Their wealthy country club friends and high society neighbors stopped answering their frantic phone calls, terrified of being associated with a federal criminal investigation. My parents were entirely isolated with absolutely no money, no leverage, and nowhere left to hide. I drove up the long, winding driveway of Big Mama's house early Thursday morning. The massive iron gates had been left wide open, and the sprawling manicured lawns already looked overgrown. I parked near the grand stone portico and walked through the heavy oak front doors, which were propped open to let the humid Georgia air circulate through the empty, echoing halls. The bank had already sent liquidators to catalog and seize the most valuable pieces of furniture and artwork to cover the remaining mountain of secondary debt my father had accumulated. The once glorious ancestral estate looked like a hollowed-out shell completely stripped of its prestige. I found my parents in the massive gourmet kitchen. The scene was so incredibly pathetic it almost looked staged. Valerie and DeAndre, the former king and queen of Atlanta high society, were standing over the marble kitchen island, shoving their remaining clothes into cheap black plastic trash bags. My father was wearing a pair of faded sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, his face covered in gray stubble and his hands shaking as he desperately tried to tie a knot in the thin plastic. My mother looked absolutely unrecognizable without her expensive blowouts and thick makeup. Her eyes were swollen and red, and she kept sniffing loudly, wiping her nose with a crumpled paper towel. They looked like two terrified strangers preparing to move into a cheap roadside motel, because that was exactly the reality staring them in the face. My footsteps echoed sharply against the hardwood floor, causing them both to jump in surprise. My mother whipped around, clutching a trash bag to her chest like a physical shield. When she saw me standing in the doorway, a flash of desperate, pathetic hope illuminated her tired eyes. She took a hesitant step forward, stammering my name and asking if I had changed my mind. She asked if I had come to bring them to my house so they would not have to sleep in my father's aging sedan. My father could not even meet my gaze. He kept his eyes glued to the marble countertop, looking utterly defeated and deeply ashamed of his own spectacular downfall. He remembered the vicious, racist insults Trent had hurled at him and realized he had traded his own flesh and blood for a monster. I did not answer my mother's desperate questions. I simply walked over to the marble island and reached into my leather tote bag. I pulled out a thick stack of heavy legal documents bound by a dark blue ribbon. I tossed the stack onto the counter right next to their pathetic pile of trash bags. The heavy thud made my father flinch and step back. I told them to look at the top page. My father slowly reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the document toward him. He adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the heavy black text. It was the official property deed transferring full total ownership of the historic Buckhead estate to the anonymous blind trust that had won the courthouse auction. My father looked up at me, his brow furrowed in total confusion. He asked why I was showing him the deed of the corporate entity that had stolen his family home. I looked him dead in the eye and let the absolute truth finally drop. I told him that the blind trust was not a corporate developer or a shadowy real estate conglomerate. I told him the trust belonged entirely to me. I was the mysterious woman at the auction. I was the one who outbid Trent's proxy, and I was the one who had legally purchased Big Mama's house right out from under them. The oxygen seemed to completely vanish from the massive kitchen. My mother dropped her trash bag, letting it hit the floor with a soft thud. A massive, hysterical smile broke out across her tear-stained face. She rushed forward, trying to grab my hands, weeping and laughing at the same time. She cried out that she knew I would never let them become homeless. She praised me, calling me her brilliant, successful daughter, claiming she always knew my stubborn independence would eventually save the family legacy. My father let out a long, shaky breath of relief, reaching up to wipe the cold sweat from his forehead, muttering that they could finally unpack their bags and pretend this entire nightmare never happened. I took a deliberate step back, completely rejecting my mother's attempted embrace. Her smile faltered instantly, freezing on her face as she saw the absolute ice in my eyes. I told them they were completely misunderstanding the situation. I told them I did not buy this massive estate to save their pride or to rescue them from the consequences of their own profound greed. I bought the house because it was a prime piece of real estate and a highly profitable asset for my growing corporate portfolio. I told them they were absolutely not getting their luxurious, carefree life back. The days of country club lunches and expensive charity galas were permanently over. My parents stared at me in horrified silence as I outlined their strict new reality. I told them that I owned every single brick of this house and I was now their official landlord. I reached into the stack of documents and pulled out an ironclad residential lease agreement, placing it directly on top of the deed. I informed them that they were welcome to stay in the house so they would not be homeless on the street, but they were going to pay me fair market value rent on the first of every single month without exception. I made it crystal clear that if they missed a single payment by even one day, I would have the county sheriff physically evict them and throw their black trash bags right onto the curb. My father stared at the lease agreement, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He whispered that they had absolutely no income and no savings left to pay market rent on a multi-million-dollar estate. I looked at the man who had called me a miserable failure and mocked my corporate career for my entire life. I smiled a cold, sharp smile and told him that he better start looking for a job. I suggested he take his extensive banking experience and apply for a teller position at a local branch, or maybe find a nice retail job at the mall to cover his monthly obligations. I told my mother she might need to swallow her pride and find some part-time work cleaning houses, just like the domestic staff she used to terrorize. They were completely paralyzed, realizing that the ultimate power dynamic had been permanently and violently shattered. They were no longer the wealthy elite parents looking down on their disappointing daughter. They were completely broke tenants who now had to punch a time clock and work menial jobs just to hand their paychecks over to the very child they had cast aside. I turned my back on their stunned, weeping faces and walked out of the kitchen. My heels echoed sharply through the empty halls of my new house, leaving them standing in the wreckage of their pride, holding a lease agreement that chained them to me forever. Exactly 1 month later, the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta swung open to a packed gallery. The air conditioning hummed loudly over the quiet, tense murmurs of the gathered crowd. Julian sat beside me in the second row, our shoulders touching as we waited for the final act of this tragedy to unfold. The courtroom was filled with the people Trent and Serena had systematically ruined over the years. There were devastated investors who had lost their life savings, betrayed charity, board members who had their reputations dragged through the mud, and former colleagues all waiting to watch the absolute destruction of the untouchable golden couple. The sheer weight of the collective anger in the room was almost suffocating, but it was also profoundly validating. I was no longer the crazy, jealous sister standing alone against their polished lies. The entire world finally saw exactly what I had known all along. The heavy side door near the judge's bench clicked open, and a collective hush fell over the massive room. Two armed United States Marshals walked in, leading my sister and her husband into the blinding fluorescent light. The transformation was completely staggering. The elite, untouchable aura that used to radiate from them had been entirely erased. Serena was wearing a standard-issue tan prison jumpsuit, her wrists chained together at her waist. Her flawless platinum highlights had faded, showing dark, unkempt roots, and her face was pale and drawn without her expensive cosmetic armor. She looked incredibly small and entirely pathetic. Trent walked behind her, shuffling in a matching uniform. The arrogant smirk that used to define his entire personality was permanently gone, replaced by the hollow, sunken stare of a man who had finally realized he was never going to win. They were no longer the kings and queens of Atlanta society. They were just two common criminals waiting for their assigned numbers. The federal judge, a stern older woman with absolutely zero tolerance for white-collar criminals, took her seat at the elevated mahogany bench. She banged her gavel once, and the sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. She looked down at Trent and Serena with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The prosecution had spent the last 4 weeks meticulously unraveling the massive web of shell companies, forged documents, and stolen charity funds. The evidence was so overwhelmingly undeniable that both of their high-priced defense attorneys had strongly advised them to take plea deals to avoid spending the rest of their natural lives behind bars. The pre-sentencing reports detailed the exact dollar amounts stolen from innocent charities and hardworking families, painting a picture of unparalleled greed. The judge called Serena to stand first. My sister slowly pushed herself out of her chair. her hands trembling so violently that the heavy metal chains rattled against the wooden defense table. Her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder, but she looked completely terrified. The judge read the formal charges detailing the systemic abuse of the philanthropic foundation and the millions of dollars Serena had eagerly funneled into her own private offshore accounts. Serena began to weep, her chest heaving as she launched into a desperate, pathetic plea for leniency. She sobbed that she was manipulated, that she did not understand the complex financial documents she was signing, and that she was just a naive, loyal wife trying to support her husband's ambitious career. She tried to use her delicate crying routine one last time, hoping the judge would view her as a fragile victim of circumstance. The judge cut her off completely, refusing to entertain a single second of her practiced victim routine. The judge looked my sister dead in the eye and told her that the paper trail proved she was a willing, enthusiastic participant in the destruction of innocent lives. The judge stated that Serena had weaponized her social status and her supposed charitable work to mask a profound, sickening greed that hurt the most vulnerable members of their community. The gavel came down again as the judge delivered the sentence. 3 years in a federal penitentiary, followed by 5 years of supervised release and massive court-ordered restitution. Serena let out a loud, horrific wail that bounced off the high ceiling, her knees buckling as the marshals forced her back into her chair. She turned her head, searching the gallery for any sign of sympathy, but when her tear-filled eyes locked onto mine, she found absolutely nothing. I sat perfectly still, offering her no comfort, no forgiveness, and absolutely no pity. My face was an unreadable mask of cold stone. Next, the judge commanded Trent to stand. He rose slowly, his shoulders slumped in total, absolute defeat. The judge did not hold back for even a fraction of a second. She verbally dismantled every single aspect of his fraudulent empire. She exposed his deep-seated arrogance, his predatory business practices, and the absolute cowardice of hiding his stolen money behind his own family members and a fake charitable foundation. She told Trent that he was not a brilliant financial mind, but rather a common parasitic thief who exploited the trust of everyone around him, simply to fund a lifestyle he never actually earned. Trent stared at the floor, unable to meet the judge's furious, piercing gaze. He tried to mumble a faint apology to the court, but his voice cracked and failed him, echoing pitifully into the microphone. The judge leaned forward and delivered the final crushing blow. She sentenced Trent to 10 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by scattered sounds of genuine relief from the people he had defrauded. 10 years. A full decade stripped of his custom suits, his luxury cars, and his desperate need for elite validation. His entire identity had been completely erased. He was going to spend the next 10 years locked in a concrete cell surrounded by barbed wire and heavily armed guards, while the world outside completely forgot he ever existed. Trent squeezed his eyes shut as a single tear rolled down his pale cheek, his entire body shaking as the true, horrifying reality of his long sentence crashed down upon him. The marshals immediately moved in to escort them out of the courtroom. The media outside would be waiting to capture their final humiliating walk to the transport bus, ensuring their disgrace was broadcast on every news channel in the country. Serena sobbed uncontrollably, dragging her feet as she was led away, looking back one last time at the life she had completely thrown away for a taste of stolen luxury. Trent kept his head down, staring at the scuffed floor, too ashamed and broken to look at anyone in the gallery. Their money was gone, their status was evaporated, and their profound arrogance had been utterly destroyed. They had gambled their entire existence on their own toxic greed, and they had lost absolutely everything. As the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind them, the courtroom slowly began to empty. Julian reached over and gently took my hand, intertwining his warm fingers with mine. I did not smile, and I did not cry. My face remained a completely unreadable mask, holding on to the quiet strength I had built over the years. People often talk about revenge as a fire that burns you from the inside out. But sitting there in that quiet courtroom, I felt nothing but a cool, steady, cleansing peace. The chaos, the manipulation, and the suffocating pressure of my family's toxic expectations had finally been silenced forever. My parents were currently scrubbing floors and working retail shifts just to pay rent on a house they used to proudly own, and my sister was preparing to sleep on a thin, uncomfortable prison mattress for the next 36 months. I stood up from the wooden bench, smoothing out my tailored blazer. I looked around the empty gallery, taking one final deep breath of the stale courthouse air before turning away. The dark, painful chapter was completely closed, and for the very first time in my entire life, the future belonged entirely to me. The weeks following that morning in the kitchen moved with a swift and brutal justice that completely finalized the destruction of the Wilson family empire. Exactly 1 month after I handed my parents that ironclad lease agreement, I sat quietly in the back row of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta with Julian by my side. We watched as Trent and Serena were finally brought before the judge to answer for their massive web of fraud and embezzlement. The entire courtroom was packed with the investors they had betrayed, the charity board members they had lied to, and the reporters who were eager to broadcast their spectacular downfall. Serena stood before the judge wearing a standard-issue tan prison jumpsuit, her pristine blonde hair dark at the roots and her face pale and drawn. All her arrogance was gone, replaced by pathetic tears, as she begged for leniency, claiming she was just a naive wife who did not understand the financial documents she signed. The judge saw right through her performance, sentencing my sister to 3 years in federal prison for wire fraud and charity embezzlement. Trent was next, and his fate was even more devastating. The judge completely dismantled his charming businessman persona, exposing him as a predatory thief, before handing down a harsh 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Their stolen money, their elite social status, and their sickening arrogance were completely erased in a matter of minutes. I sat in the gallery watching them get led away in heavy steel handcuffs, my face an unreadable mask of absolute cold closure. I felt no tears, no regret, and absolutely no pity for the monsters who had tried to destroy me. 6 months later, the air in Atlanta had turned crisp and cold as winter settled over the city, bringing with it a profound sense of peace I had never experienced before. It was Christmas Eve, and snowflakes were gently falling outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the gorgeous new modern penthouse Julian and I had purchased together in Midtown. The transition from the suffocating shadows of my past into this bright, beautiful future was nothing short of extraordinary. My marketing and crisis management firm had exploded in growth after the dust settled from the federal investigation. Clients flocked to us knowing I was the architect who had meticulously uncovered and dismantled one of the biggest fraud rings in the city. My firm was now considered an absolute titan in the industry, commanding massive retainers and handling the most exclusive corporate accounts in the Southeast. I was no longer the forgotten, disappointing daughter hiding in the background. I was a highly respected, self-made powerhouse, entirely independent and completely untouchable. The penthouse was filled with the warm, golden light of dozens of candles and the rich, comforting smell of roasted garlic and fresh herbs. Julian and I were hosting a small, intimate holiday dinner party, surrounded only by the people who truly mattered. There were no fake socialites, no greedy opportunists, and no toxic family members looking to exploit us for their own gain. Instead, the room was filled with my loyal team members, the mentors who had supported my vision, and the genuine friends who had stood by my side when my biological family had thrown me to the wolves. Soft jazz played from the hidden speakers as laughter echoed through the spacious open-concept living room. I watched Julian pouring expensive red wine for our guests, his eyes finding mine across the room and offering a warm, knowing smile. We had built this beautiful sanctuary together brick by brick, and nobody could ever take it away from us. While I stood in my beautiful home surrounded by love and success, my parents were experiencing a very different kind of Christmas Eve. The reality of their new life under my absolute financial control had completely broken their former aristocratic delusions. DeAndre, the man who used to look down on working-class people from the balcony of his country club, was currently gripping the steering wheel of his aging sedan, navigating the freezing holiday traffic as an Uber driver. His custom-tailored suits had been replaced by a cheap uniform jacket, and his days were spent catering to the demands of rude, impatient passengers who treated him like a servant. Every single ride he completed, every late-night airport pickup, and every frustrating traffic jam was a constant, grueling reminder of the wealth and respect he had so carelessly thrown away. He was working himself to the bone, driving 12-hour shifts just to scrape together enough cash to meet his obligations. My mother Valerie was faring no better in her brutal new reality. The woman who used to host lavish charity galas and sneer at domestic workers was currently standing behind the counter of a high-end retail boutique, folding clothes for minimum wage. Her feet ached from standing on the hard commercial floors all day, and her pride was battered every time one of her former society friends walked into the store and saw her wearing a name tag. She had to smile and offer customer service to the very women she used to compete with, desperately trying to hide her profound humiliation as they pitied her spectacular fall from grace. She spent her days organizing clearance racks and taking inventory because she had absolutely no other choice. They both had to work these grueling, humiliating jobs for one simple, inescapable reason: they had to pay their rent. Every single month, on the first of the month, they were legally obligated to wire a massive market rate rent payment directly into my corporate account just to keep living in the Buckhead estate they used to own. The power dynamic was permanently shattered. They were literally working themselves to death for the daughter they had spent their entire lives calling a failure. I walked over to the marble kitchen island to retrieve my wine glass when my phone buzzed softly against the countertop. The caller ID displayed my mother's name, illuminating the dim space with a harsh, sudden light. I excused myself from the lively conversation in the living room and stepped out onto the quiet, covered balcony, letting the freezing winter air wash over my face. I stared at the glowing screen for a long moment, listening to the sounds of my chosen family, laughing warmly inside, before finally swiping to answer the call. My mother's voice came through the speaker, thick and choked with heavy, exhausted tears. She was crying hysterically, the sound of retail holiday music playing faintly in the background of her break room. Valerie sobbed into the phone, apologizing frantically for everything she had ever done to me. She begged for my forgiveness, completely broken by the relentless exhaustion of her retail job and the terrifying reality of her ruined life. She told me how incredibly sorry she was for choosing Serena over me, for doubting my business acumen, and for turning a blind eye to Trent's massive fraud. She wept that she and my father were working themselves into an early grave just to afford the rent I demanded, and she begged me to show them some mercy because it was Christmas. I stood on the balcony looking out over the glittering Atlanta skyline, letting her desperate apologies wash over me without feeling a single ounce of guilt or sympathy. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant comparisons, and the brutal way they had tried to sacrifice me to save a monster. I listened politely to her frantic, pathetic sobbing, allowing her to completely empty her soul into the phone. I lifted my crystal glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive red wine, letting the rich flavor coat my tongue. When her weeping finally dissolved into exhausted silence, I spoke. My voice was incredibly calm, smooth, and completely devoid of any emotion. I said, "Merry Christmas, Mom. Just a reminder. Rent is due on the 1st, do not be late." I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button immediately, cutting off her frantic, panicked gasp. I blocked her. Number slipped the phone into the pocket of my silk trousers and walked back inside the warm, bright penthouse. Julian was waiting near the glass doors, and as our eyes met, a genuine, peaceful smile spread across my face. The screen of my old life faded to black, replaced by the brilliant light of the empire I had built. True revenge was never about screaming or causing a dramatic scene. True revenge was simply walking away, stepping into your own immense power, and letting those who foolishly underestimated you spend the rest of their pathetic lives paying for it. True security and self-worth come from within, not from toxic family members who try to undermine you. When you stop seeking validation from those who offer conditional love, you free yourself to build your own incredible empire. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting the past or allowing abuse to continue. It simply means reclaiming your ultimate power, setting firm boundaries, and boldly walking away from anyone who refuses to respect you. Have you ever had to permanently walk away from toxic relatives just to protect your inner peace? Share your unique journey below and please subscribe for more healing stories.